Dear viewer, you are about to immerse yourself in a story that takes place in the frozen lands of Patagonia, where the winter cold contrasts with the warmth of hearts that learn to beat together after the storm. From what corner of the world are you joining us today? Wherever you may be, I invite you to let yourself be enveloped by this narrative of survival and love that rises from the ashes of abandonment. If this story moves, you don't forget to leave your like and subscribe for more stories that connect us with our human essence. Patagonia, Argentina. Winter of 1859. Snowflakes fell like celestial tears upon the white immensity of Patagonia. The wind howled like a wounded wolf, mercilessly whipping the exhausted bodies that moved like faltering shadows on that frozen canvas. Dolores Quintana, whom everyone called Lola, felt her legs turning into fragile branches about to break. Her 3 children followed her like disoriented chicks. Josefina, 13, held the hand of Margarita, barely 5, while Sebastian, who had just turned 10, walked with his gaze fixed on the footprints his mother left in the snow. 3 days had passed since the wheel of their cart broke on the sharp stones of the road. 3 days of walking under the frozen mantle of the Patagonian winter, with provisions dwindling as quickly as their hopes. "Mama, I can't feel my fingers," whispered Margarita, her voice trembling like a candle flame exposed to the wind. Lola stopped crouching to take her daughter's small hands. She rubbed them between her own, blowing warm breath over them. Then she untied her own woolen shawl and wrapped it around the child's shoulders over the already existing layers. "A little more, my darling, just a little more," she murmured, though her words were lost among the howls of the wind. Lola's lips, cracked by the cold, drew a smile that didn't reach her eyes. Hazel eyes that hid frozen tears and the weight of desperate decisions. They had abandoned the little they had when the land administrator sent by Gervasio gave them 3 days to leave. 3 days to dismantle a life. The sun was beginning to descend behind the mountains when Josefina saw it, a dark spot in the whiteness, a promise of shelter. Mama, there by the lake. Through the curtain of snow that thickened with the falling evening, a cabin could be distinguished. The smoke escaping from its chimney rose like a prayer to the overcast sky. Lola felt her heart skip a beat, clinging to this vision like one who clings to the last branch before falling into the abyss. She guided her children toward that light filtering through a solitary window. Her knuckles knocked on the rough wood with what little strength she had left. The silence that followed seemed eternal until the creak of footsteps on wooden boards announced movement inside. The door opened with the lament of rusty hinges, and a man with a severe face and graying beard appeared before them. His eyes, the color of melting ice, scanned the 4 unexpected visitors. "Please," Lola spoke with a voice she barely recognized as her own. "My children. The cold." The man, Francisco Sarmiento, remained motionless like a pillar of salt. His gaze seemed to contain the weight of 1,000 winters. For an instant, that seemed to freeze time itself. Lola feared he would close the door, condemning them to the white death that stalked them. Then, without a word, Francisco stepped back, opening the way to the warmth emanating from inside. The 4 entered like castaways reaching shore. The contrast between the hostile exterior and the warmth of the cabin made their skin burn and involuntary tears spring from their eyes. The fireplace crackled in a corner, casting dancing shadows on walls of weathered wood. "Get closer to the fire," the man finally said, with a voice as rough as if he hadn't used it in a long time. "Outside, you wouldn't survive this night." Lola helped her children remove their soaked outer layers. Her fingers, numbed, struggled with knots and buttons, while Francisco placed 3 cups on the pine table and poured a steaming liquid into them. That night, as the storm roared like a furious beast against the windows, the 4 strangers huddled near the hearth. Francisco gave them his bed, a simple structure covered with thick woolen blankets, and he settled on an improvised cot by the fire. Before closing her eyes, overcome by exhaustion, Lola observed the silhouette of their host, outlined against the flames. What kind of man lived alone in the midst of the white immensity? What secrets did his silence hold? Outside, the wind continued to sing its ancestral song, but within those walls, 4 exhausted hearts found a new rhythm, still oblivious to the designs that fate had in store for them. Dawn brought with it a deceptive calm. The storm had temporarily subsided, leaving behind a blanket of pristine snow covering every visible corner from the frosted windows. Lola was the first to awaken, startled by the strangeness of the surroundings. For a fleeting moment, disorientation took hold of her until the events of the previous day rushed back to her memory. She sat up slowly, careful not to wake her children who slept deeply, intertwined, like roots seeking sustenance in the same soil. Sebastian had a protective arm over Margarita, while Josefina had curled up with her back to them, as if even in dreams she sought to maintain the composure that a 13-year-old girl thought necessary. The cabin was silent, but Francisco was not there. Lola approached the window, cleaning a circle in the fogged glass with her breath. Outside, the solitary figure of their host methodically chopped wood. Each blow seemed to follow an internal rhythm, a cadence of contained thoughts. Lola took advantage of the solitude to examine the space that had served as their refuge. The cabin was simple but orderly, with rudimentary furniture that Francisco had probably built with his own hands. A shelf held some books, worn by time, and on a table rested wood carving tools. Everything spoke of an austere but dignified life. Her gaze stopped in a corner of the wall, where a blanket covered what appeared to be a picture. Curiosity overcame discretion, and with cautious fingers, Lola slightly lifted the edge of the fabric. Beneath it, a family portrait looked at her Francisco younger, and with a face less marked by the inclemencies of time, alongside a woman with a serene smile and a small boy. Her eyes moistened at that vision. Where would they be now? Why did Francisco hide this image under a cloth like one who covers a wound he doesn't want to see? The noise of the door opening startled her. She quickly dropped the fabric and moved away from the corner, feeling the heat of shame rise to her cheeks. Francisco entered, carrying logs in his arms, his breath visible in small clouds that dissipated in the air. Their eyes met, and for an instant Lola thought she saw a flash of understanding in those clear eyes, as if he knew exactly what she had just done. However, he made no mention of it. "Good morning," she said, trying to make her voice sound firm. "I thank you for having taken first in last night." Francisco slowly deposited the logs next to the fireplace. His face was an impenetrable mask, but his whitened knuckles betrayed the tension running through him. "It doesn't matter," he finally said with a voice that pretended to be indifferent, but vibrated with contained emotions. "They are memories. That time has not been able to erase." Sebastian, perceiving the tension, approached the man, and with the innocence of his 10 years placed a hand on his arm. "Is that your family?" he asked with that childish curiosity that knows no boundaries. Francisco looked at the boy, and something in his gaze softened imperceptibly. "They were," he answered after a long silence. "Elena and Matthias, my wife and my son." Lola held her breath. It was the first time Francisco had shared something personal, that he had opened a crack in the wall of silence behind which he took refuge. That night, while the children slept, Lola sat with Francisco by the fire. The silence between them was no longer uncomfortable, but expectant, like plowed land awaiting seeds. "My Aunt Teresa raised me from the age of 8. Lola began, not knowing exactly why she felt the need to share her story. "My mother died of pneumonia during a particularly cruel winter similar to this one." Francisco watched her, without interrupting, his eyes reflecting the dancing flames. "I married young to Gervasio, too young to understand what it meant to join my life to that of a man like him." She continued, her fingers nervously playing with the frayed edge of her shawl. "At first, everything seemed perfect. We had a small house near Bariloche, and he worked at Mr. Mendoza's estate. Then came the children, and with them the changes in Gervasio. The shadows seemed to accumulate in the corners of the cabin, as if they too wanted to hear the story that Lola was unveiling. Wine became his refuge and his demon. His absences grew longer, his returns more violent. One day, 3 months ago, he simply didn't come back." Her voice broke slightly. "A week later, a letter arrived. He had sold our land he never put in my name. We had 3 days to leave." Francisco remained silent for a moment, as if digesting each word. "Where were you headed when the storm caught you?" he finally asked. "North," Lola replied. "I have a cousin in Neuquén who might be able to help us. or so I told myself to have some direction to follow. Francisco nodded slightly. Then, with a gesture that seemed to cost him an immense effort, he got up and went to the covered portrait. With hands that Lola noticed were slightly trembling, he completely removed the blanket. "Elena loved to sing," he said, contemplating the face of the woman in the portrait. "She said that songs were bridges built between souls. Matias was barely 6 years old when the fever took them both. It was 7 winters ago." Lola felt her eyes moisten, not out of compassion but out of recognition. Both had lost something essential, both carried invisible scars. "Why did you allow us to stay?" she asked, the question that had been circling her mind since that first night. Francisco looked at her again, and in his eyes shone something that Lola could not interpret. "Because there are nights when the silence screams too loudly," he answered with simplicity. Outside, the snow continued to fall, erasing footprints covering the past. Inside, 2 stories began to intertwine like threads of the same fabric, still not knowing what design they would form together. The snow gradually began to cede its dominion over the landscape. Small patches of dark earth appeared like islands in a white sea that retreated with reluctance. The sky, previously perpetually grey, showed occasional stretches of blue that Margarita pointed to with eager fingers. A month had passed since that stormy night when Francisco had opened his door to them. A month in which the cabin, once as silent as a crypt, had gradually filled with the sounds of life. Margarita's crystalline laughter, Sebastian's hurried steps, the hushed conversations between Lola and Josefina. That morning, Francisco and Sebastian worked together in the shed. The man was teaching the boy the basics of wood carving, a knowledge that his rough hands transmitted with unusual patience. Lola watched them from the window, moved by the concentration on her son's face, and by the delicacy with which Francisco guided his small hands over the wood. "They look alike, don't they?" commented Josefina, silently appearing at her side. "When they're like that concentrated on something, they have the same expression." Lola did not respond, but the observation hit her with the force of an unexpected revelation. It was true. There was something in the way Sebastian slightly furrowed, his brow identical to the gesture Francisco made when he concentrated on some meticulous task. "The road to San Antonio del Sur must be clear now," continued Josefina, with that acute sensitivity that sometimes made Lola forget she was barely 13 years old. "We could continue our journey." The words hung in the air like snowflakes that refused to touch the ground. Lola felt a knot form in her throat. It was true, there was no longer a storm that justified their permanence. There was no longer an excuse to continue being a burden for that solitary man who had generously offered them shelter. "Yes," she finally replied, with a voice that tried to sound decided. "We must continue." But something inside her rebelled against that idea, something she did not dare to name. That afternoon, while Francisco cut wood outside, Lola discreetly began to gather the few belongings they had brought with them. Each garment she folded, each object she stored in the worn bundle seemed to weigh more than before. Francisco entered the cabin when she was storing Margarita's last dress. Their eyes met over the flowered and worn fabric. It wasn't necessary for Lola to explain what she was doing. Understanding flowed between them like a silent river. "San Antonio del Sur is a day's journey," said Francisco, depositing the logs next to the fireplace. "I could accompany you there." "We don't want to continue abusing your generosity," Lola replied with that dignity that had sustained her through all the storms of her life. Francisco took a step toward her. The late afternoon light filtering through the window drew elongated shadows on his face. "It's not a burden," he said simply. "Besides, I've needed to acquire supplies for some time." Lola nodded, unable to articulate the contradictory emotions that overwhelmed her. Relief at not having to undertake the journey alone with her children. Sadness, because each step toward San Antonio del Sur would be a step that would take them away from this cabin that in just a month had begun to feel strangely like a home. The next morning, they set out with the first rays of the sun. Francisco had prepared a simple cart, pulled by a robust horse with chestnut fur. Margarita had instantly become fond of the animal which she had baptized as Canela for the color of its mane. The path wound between gentle hills and forests of lengus and coihus. Francisco drove with his gaze fixed on the horizon, while Lola felt that every meter traveled was a small farewell. "Why do you live so far from the village?" asked Sebastian, breaking the silence that had settled between them. Francisco took time to respond, as if searching for the right words somewhere, deep within himself. "After losing Elena and Matthias, the noise of other lives became unbearable to me," he finally replied. "Every childish laugh, every couple holding hands, everything reminded me of what I no longer had." Lola felt her heart shrink at that confession, offered with such devastating simplicity. "And now?" she dared to ask. Francisco turned slightly toward her. His eyes, the color of ice melting in spring, seemed to truly contemplate her for the first time. "Now I discover that there are silences more painful than any noise." They traveled the rest of the journey in reflective silence, occasionally interrupted by the exclamations of wonder, from the children at the sight of a condor soaring over the mountains or a fox swiftly crossing the path. San Antonio del Sur appeared before them when the sun was beginning its descent. It was a small town, little more than a main street, with wooden and stone houses on both sides, a modest church with a bell tower and a central plaza where a centennial ombu tree extended its branches like protective arms. The arrival of the cart attracted curious glances. It had been a long time since Francisco Sarmiento had been seen in town, and even less accompanied. They stopped in front of Mr. Mendez's grocery store, a chubby man with a thick mustache who received them with joviality. "Francisco, we were beginning to believe the wolves had devoured you," he joked, then turning his attention to Lola and the children. "And these strangers, the storm caught them near my cabin," Francisco answered tersely, avoiding elaboration. A small elderly woman with white hair gathered in a tight bun approached them. Her eyes, lively despite her age, scrutinized the newcomers with friendly curiosity. "Doña Carmen," Francisco greeted with a respectful bow. The old woman smiled, revealing the absence of several teeth. She approached Margarita, who was partially hiding behind her mother's skirts. From her pocket, she extracted a blue silk ribbon, worn but still beautiful. "For you, child," she said, offering it with knotty hands. "A princess needs something pretty in her hair." Margarita accepted the gift with bright eyes. Lola, moved by that spontaneous gesture of generosity, felt a solitary tear slip down her cheek. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice breaking slightly. Doña Carmen looked at her then, and in her wrinkled eyes shone an understanding as old as Patagonia itself. "Winter always yields to spring, daughter," she said in a soft voice. "It's the law of life." While Francisco acquired the necessary provisions, Lola and the children waited by the cart. The reality of their situation fell upon her like a heavy mantle. The time for decisions had come. They had to continue to New Ken, search for that cousin she barely remembered, try to rebuild their lives from nothing. The sun was descending behind the mountains when Francisco returned, carrying bags and packages that he deposited in the cart. The twilight tinged the sky with purple and orange hues, turning the clouds into islands of floating fire. "It's getting late," he said, avoiding, looking directly at Lola. "We wouldn't reach New Ken before nightfall." Lola nodded, aware of what those words implied. A temporary return to the cabin, a postponed farewell. During the return journey, Margarita fell asleep, curled up against Josefina. Sebastian struggled to keep his eyes open, fascinated by the first stars that began to sprinkle the sky. "Thank you for bringing us," Lola said when the silence became too dense, "for everything." Francisco kept his gaze fixed on the road, but his hands visibly tensed on the reins. "You could," he began, and then stopped as if the words were frightened birds he didn't dare to release. "Yes," she encouraged, feeling her heart inexplicably accelerate. "You could stay," he finally said, the words coming out hurriedly, "in the cabin until you decide what to do." Lola held her breath. In the silence that followed, only the creaking of the wheels on the road and the rhythmic sound of the sleeping children's breathing could be heard. "Solitude is not always a good counselor," Francisco added in a voice so low that Lola could barely hear him. The cabin appeared before them, a silhouette cut against the night sky. A light shone weakly inside. I left the oil lamp lit, Francisco murmured, confused. As they got closer, they discovered that the door was ajar. Francisco stopped abruptly, gesturing to Lola to stay with the children. Cautiously, he approached the entrance, tensing every muscle in his body. A figure emerged from the inner shadows, tall with broad shoulders and a face framed by an unkempt beard. Lola felt the world stop when her eyes recognized who stood before them. Gervasio, she whispered, and his name was like ice on her lips. Time seemed to freeze in that instant, as if the night held its breath at the scene unfolding in front of the cabin. Gervasio Vega stepped forward, his figure silhouetted against the yellowish light escaping from the half-open door. His eyes, which Lola remembered as vivacious and seductive in the past, now looked reddened and sunken, in a face that drink and vicissitudes had deeply marked. "My dear wife," he said with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "What a moving encounter after so long searching for you." Lola instinctively moved to place herself between him and the children, who, awakened by the voices, watched the scene with eyes widened by fear. Sebastian was the first to react, standing up in the cart with clenched fists. "You're not welcome. Here," the boy spat with a fierceness that made Lola feel a painful pride. Gervasio let out a dry laugh devoid of humor. "And who are you to decide that, brat? I am your father. This woman is my wife. You are my children. The law and God give me rights over all of you." Francisco stepped forward, silently interposing himself between Gervasio and the cart where Lola and the children were. Although he was a few centimeters shorter than Gervasio, something in his posture, in the dangerous calm that emanated from him, made the other man imperceptibly retreat. "You are on my property," said Francisco with a calm but firm voice, "and here you are not welcome." Gervasio narrowed his eyes, evaluating the man in front of him. "So this is your new protector, Lola," he commented with disdain. "How quickly you found a replacement. How little our marriage before God was worth." Lola slowly descended from the cart, her legs trembling, but her spirit erect, like a tree that has endured 1,000 storms. "You dare to speak of worth, Gervasio?" She responded, her voice low but clear in the stillness of the night. "You who abandoned us, you who sold our home without caring if your children would sleep under a roof or not." Behind Gervasio appeared 2 more men, silent shadows until then. Lola recognized one of them, Miguel Sosa, former foreman of the estate where Gervasio had worked. The other was a stranger of rough appearance and elusive gaze. "I've come to recover what is mine by right," declared Gervasio, drawing himself up to his full height. "My children deserve their father, and you, Lola, are still my wife before God and before the law." Francisco remained motionless, but his eyes had turned the color of steel under the silver light of the moon. "The law also recognizes abandonment," he said with measured voice, "and a mother's right to protect her children." "And who are you to speak of law?" Gervasio spat. "The hermit who lives apart from everyone, the man who now delights in another's wife." Something changed in Francisco's face. A muscle twitched in his jaw, the only visible sign of the storm raging inside him. "I will give you only one chance to leave," he said, his voice as cold as the wind blowing from the mountains. "You and your companions now." Gervasio hesitated. There was something about Francisco, perhaps the calm with which he stood firm before 3 men, perhaps the determined gleam in his eyes that suggested an unsuspected strength. "I'll be back," he finally promised, taking a step back. "With the law on my side, Commissioner Suarez is an old friend, and a father's rights are above the whims of a woman who abandons the home." Lola felt her insides freeze. She knew Suarez, a man who could be bought with a few coins or bottles of good liquor. "I'm going to recover my children," Gervasio continued, looking directly at Lola, "and you too if you show the proper repentance." With these words he gestured to his companions, and the 3 disappeared into the darkness of the road. When the sound of their footsteps vanished, Lola felt her legs give way. Francisco was by her side in an instant, holding her by the shoulders. The contact, though brief, transmitted a warmth that contrasted with the cold left behind by Gervasio's presence. "I won't let him take them," said Francisco, and there was in his voice a promise as solid as the mountains that surrounded them. Inside the cabin, while helping the children settle in, Lola felt that her mind was a whirlwind of terrifying thoughts. She knew Hervasio, his obstinacy, his wounded pride. He would not leave without getting what he considered his. "Mom, Josefina's." Voice brought her back to the present. "Is he going to take us with him?" The three children looked at her with eyes that mixed fear with absolute confidence in her ability to protect them. Lola knelt before them, taking their hands in hers. "Never," she replied with a conviction that sprang from the deepest part of her being. "They will never separate you from me." Later, when the children had finally fallen asleep, Lola found Francisco sitting by the fire, methodically carving a piece of wood with his knife. "We should go," she said, sitting across from him. "Our presence will only bring you trouble." Francisco continued carving for a few moments as if he hadn't heard her. Then, without raising his eyes from his work, he replied, "If you leave, it will be easier for him to catch you. But if we stay—" "If you stay," he interrupted, finally raising his eyes to her, "you will be under my protection. And I know these lands better than anyone. Better than Hervasio, better than Commissioner Suarez." Something in his voice made Lola feel a strange mixture of fear and security. Who was this man really, who was willing to face so much for them? "Why?" she asked the question that had been burning inside her since that first stormy night. "Why would you do all this for us?" Francisco gently placed the piece of wood on the table. In his hands a small horse had taken shape, carved with astonishing precision. "Because when I found you that night, I saw in your eyes the same pain I have carried with me for 7 winters, he replied with simplicity. "And because your children remind me that life continues even after the most terrible losses." He rose slowly, gathering some logs to feed the fire. "There is a small room at the back of the cabin," he continued, changing the subject. "I used it as storage, but it can be converted into a space for the children. Tomorrow I will begin to prepare it." Lola felt tears come to her eyes, but she contained them. They were not tears of sadness, but of something more complex, gratitude, relief, and a new emotion that she did not yet dare to name. Outside, the Patagonian night unfurled its starry mantle over the sleeping land. Inside, 2 souls wounded by life began to recognize each other for what they were, potential refugees for one another. Dawn brought with it a clear sky of such an intense blue that it hurt to look at it directly. Lola awoke with a start, the events of the previous night still fresh in her memory. For an instant, the terror of seeing Hervasio again compressed her chest like an invisible hand, but the familiar sound of Francisco chopping wood outside anchored her once more to the present reality. She rose silently, careful not to wake the children. Through the window she observed Francisco working methodically. There was something hypnotic in his movements, in the precision with which the axe descended and rose in the constant rhythm that seemed to reflect an unbreakable determination. When she went outside, the cold morning air enveloped her like an invigorating embrace. Francisco sensed her approach, but continued with his task without turning around. "I've thought of everything," he said without preamble. "Suarez won't come today. Gervasio will need time to convince him to obtain some kind of document. We have perhaps a day, maybe 2. Lola hugged herself, trying to contain the trembling that did not come from the cold. "What will we do then?" she asked, hating the tone of vulnerability in her own voice. Francisco set down the axe and turned to her. The rising sun illuminated his profile, momentarily softening the lines of hardness that time and pain had carved into his face. "We'll go to town," he replied. "We'll talk to Father Tomas. He's a respected man, his word carries weight. And Doña Carmen knows everyone in the valley, she has influence. If the community is on our side, it will be more difficult for Hervasio to take the children, even with Suarez supporting him." Lola nodded slowly. The idea made sense, although fear persisted inside her like a crouching animal. "Do you think they will support us?" she asked. "We are strangers to them." A slight smile, the first Lola had seen on his face, curved Francisco's lips. "I too was a stranger when I arrived here 7 years ago. They welcomed me without questions when I needed it most. They are good people." Sebastian appeared in the cabin door, rubbing his eyes with one hand, while the other held a small piece of wood. Upon seeing Francisco, he ran to him with childish enthusiasm. "Look!" he exclaimed, showing him the piece of wood on which he had Tried to carve something during the night. I tried to make a horse like yours. Francisco crouched to better observe the boy's work. It was barely recognizable as an animal with rough shapes and evident disproportions, but there was a genuine effort in it. It's a good start, he said, examining the piece with seriousness. You have strong hands, Sebastian. With practice, you'll achieve great things. The boy's face lit up with pride. Lola watched the scene with a lump in her throat. There was something deeply moving about the way Francisco treated her son with respect, without condescension, recognizing his potential. After a simple breakfast, they prepared the cart to head to San Antonio del Sur. The children were unusually silent. Gervasio's appearance had left a trail of uneasiness that not even the daylight managed to completely dispel. The journey passed without incidents. Francisco drove with a concentrated expression, while Lola tried to distract the children by pointing out the birds crossing the sky or the occasional guanacos watching their passage from distant hills. Upon reaching the town, they went directly to the small stone church. Father Tomas, a middle-aged man with prematurely grey hair and kind eyes, received them with genuine joy. "Francisco, what a surprise to see you 2 days in a row in town," he commented firmly, shaking his hand. "And I see your guests are still with you." Francisco nodded, proceeding to explain the situation without beating around the bush. As the story unfolded, the priest's face gradually darkened. "Gervasio Vega," he murmured when Francisco finished his account. "I know him. He has passed through town occasionally, always in search of liquor and trouble." He turned to Lola, his eyes reflecting sincere compassion. "Do you have any document that proves the abandonment daughter? Something that proves he stopped supporting his children?" Lola shook her head, feeling that the hope that had begun to sprout withered again. "We only have our word," she responded in a low voice. Father Thomas sighed, but his expression remained determined. "Sometimes the word of a united community is worth more than any signed paper," he said. "Let's visit Doña Carmen. She is the living memory of this valley, and her house is a meeting place for many." The old woman's house was at the opposite end of town, a construction of stone and wood, with a small garden where medicinal herbs and weather-resistant flowers grew. Despite her advanced age, Doña Carmen received them with surprising energy, inviting them in while she put water to boil for mate. "I had already been told that Gervasio Vega was roaming the area," said the old woman while serving the infusion, "in carved gourds. News flies faster than condors in these valleys." With astonishing efficiency, Doña Carmen sent a passing child in front of her house with messages for several people in town. In less than an hour, the modest room had filled with a dozen neighbors, all listening attentively, as Lola, with a voice that gained firmness as she spoke, related her story. "My Anselmo used to say that a man's character is known by how he treats his family and his animals," commented Doña Carmen when Lola finished. "This Gervasio has failed both tests according to what you tell." A murmur of assent ran through the room. Pedro Mendez, the owner of the grocery store, stepped forward. "My father was a justice of the peace for 20 years, he said in a grave voice. "He always said that the law is to protect the weak, not to arm the strong. If this man abandoned his family and now claims them as one claims cattle, then he is twisting the law to his convenience." One by one, the neighbors expressed their support. Lola felt her heart expand with each word of solidarity. Francisco at her side remained silent, but attentive, as if each favorable voice was a small victory in a larger battle. By nightfall, they returned to the cabin with promises of help and an agreed plan. If Gervasio returned with Commissioner Suarez and some document, the entire community of San Antonio del Sur would present itself as witness to the abandonment and the questionable character of the man. That night, while the children slept, Lola and Francisco remained seated by the fire, the silence between them comfortable like a shared blanket in winter. "Today I saw something I thought I would never experience again," Lola finally said, contemplating the dancing flames. "What thing?" asked Francisco, his voice soft in the twilight. "Community," she replied. "People willing to defend those they barely know just because it's the right thing." Francisco nodded slightly, his eyes reflecting the fire. "You would do the same for them," he said, not as a question but as a certainty. "Yes," confirmed Lola. "I would." A creak outside startled them. Francisco immediately got up, moving silently toward the window. He scrutinized the darkness for a few moments, then visibly relaxed. "It's Father Tomas," he announced, heading toward the door. The priest entered, wrapping himself in a woolen cloak against the night cold. Behind him, surprisingly, came Doña Carmen, leaning on a carved wooden staff. "Excuse the hour," said Father Tomas, "but we've had news that couldn't wait until tomorrow." "Gervasio has been with Lawyer Peralta this afternoon," continued Doña Carmen, sitting near the fire. "They're preparing documents. My nephew works in his office and heard everything." "What kind of documents?" asked Lola, feeling fear return like a tide. "False declarations," replied the old woman. "Invented testimonies claiming that you abandoned your husband, taking his children away, that you are a negligent mother. Suarez is willing to support these lies in exchange for money and favors." Francisco clenched his fists, but his voice remained controlled when he spoke. "When do they plan to come?" "Tomorrow at noon," replied Father Tomas. "But they won't come alone. We have sent messengers to all the families in the valley. We will be here before them." Lola felt tears come to her eyes, but this time she didn't try to contain them. They were tears of gratitude, of relief at discovering they were not alone in this battle. Doña Carmen approached her, taking her hands between her own, wrinkled and knotty but surprisingly warm. "The true power of a mother is the love for her children," said the old woman with a soft but firm voice. "And that power is stronger than any falsified document, than any corrupt man." When the visitors left, promising to return early the next day, Lola felt a strange calm settle inside her. Fear was still there, crouched like a stalking animal, but alongside it, something new had been born, the certainty that she would not face this trial alone. Francisco, who was watching her from the other side of the room, seemed to read her thoughts. "Rest," he said gently. "Tomorrow you will need all your strength." She nodded, but before retiring to the improvised bed where her children slept, she stopped beside him. "Thank you," she said simply, "for everything." He looked into her eyes, and in his gaze was something that made Lola's heart inexplicably quicken. "There is nothing to thank me for," he replied. "I too am finding something I thought lost forever." "What?" she asked, repeating his question from moments before. A barely perceptible smile curved Francisco's lips. "Hope," he answered, with simplicity. Outside night spread its starry mantle over sleeping Patagonia, a mantle that sheltered valleys and mountains alike, solitary cabins, and united towns, fearful hearts and hopeful souls. Noon approached with the inevitability of the tides. The sun had risen in a clear sky, bathing the cabin and its surroundings, with a golden light that contrasted with the tension floating in the air. Since dawn, neighbors from San Antonio del Sur had been arriving in small groups, some on horseback, others on foot, even entire families in rickety carts. Now more than 30 people were gathered in front of the cabin, forming a human barrier of solidarity. Lola observed the scene from the window, with Margarita clinging to her skirt like a small shadow. The child, usually vivacious, had been unusually quiet all morning, as if she perceived the gravity of what was about to happen. "Is Father coming to take us?" she finally asked in a barely audible voice. Lola knelt in front of her, taking her small hands in hers. "No one is going to separate you from me," she responded, looking directly into her eyes. "I promise you, my darling." Sebastian approached them, his childish face marked by a seriousness unusual for his 10 years. "I will protect them," he declared, drawing himself up to his full height. "Francisco has taught me to be brave." Lola felt her heart painfully expand at her son's words. In just a few weeks, the bond between Sebastian and Francisco had strengthened to become as solid as the mountains surrounding them. Josefina remained seated by the table, nervously crumbling a piece of bread between her fingers. Of the 3 children, she was the one who best remembered Gervasio, who had witnessed his fits of rage when alcohol clouded his reason. "I don't want to go back with him," she murmured when she noticed Lola's gaze upon her. "Never." Francisco entered at that moment, his face severe but calm, like one who prepares for an inevitable storm. "They're coming up the main road," he announced. "Father Tomas has seen them from the hill." Lola nodded, feeling a knot form in her throat. She took a deep breath, trying to calm her racing heart. "Children, stay inside until I tell you," she instructed, kissing their foreheads one by one. "Everything will be fine." Outside, the gathered neighbors had formed a semicircle in front of the cabin. Doña Carmen, despite her advanced age, stood erect beside Father Tomas. Pedro Mendez, the store owner, and his wife Rosario held their two small daughters by the hand. Entire families, some that Lola barely knew by sight, formed a wall of flesh and bone of collective dignity. They didn't have to wait long. The sound of hooves and wheels announced the arrival of the group led by Gervasio. There were 5 men on horseback. Gervasio, Commissioner Suarez with his distinctive black hat, a thin, nervous man who must have been Lawyer Peralta, and the same 2 companions from the previous night. Seeing the crowd gathered, Gervasio abruptly stopped his horse. An expression of bewilderment crossed his face, quickly replaced by a mask of forced determination. He dismounted with a movement that pretended to be elegant, but betrayed a certain imbalance, probably the product of a shared bottle to give him courage. His eyes scanned those present until they came to rest on Lola, who had left the cabin and now stood beside Francisco. "I see you've gathered quite a welcome committee, my wife," he said with a twisted smile. "Such a commotion wasn't necessary to receive your husband." Commissioner Suarez dismounted in turn, adjusting the belt where his revolver hung in an obviously intimidating gesture. He was a corpulent man with a thick mustache and a shifty gaze that never looked directly into the eyes. "We come on official business," he announced, taking out a folded document from his jacket. "I have here an order that grants custody of the minors Josefina Sebastián and Margarita Vega to their legitimate father Don Gervasio Vega." Father Tomas stepped forward, his small figure, but dignifiedly erect. "Commissioner Suarez, I'm afraid there are aspects of this matter of which you are unaware," he said in a clear voice that resonated in the clearing. "Mr. Vega abandoned his family months ago, leaving them without home or sustenance." "Lies," spat Gervasio. "My wife took my children while I was working in the northern estates. I've traveled half the country looking for them." "I have witnesses to his abandonment," intervened Lawyer Peralta, a man of nervous gestures and calculating gaze. "Respectable people who confirm Mr. Vega's accusations." "And where are these witnesses?" asked Doña Carmen, advancing with the help of her staff. "Why haven't they come to show their faces?" The lawyer seemed momentarily disconcerted, but quickly recovered. "Their testimonies are duly notarized in these documents," he replied, extracting several papers from his briefcase. Pedro Mendez stepped forward. "We are also witnesses," he declared in a firm voice. "Witnesses to how this family arrived in our community in the midst of a storm on the verge of death from cold because someone had left them without shelter." His wife Rosario nodded, adding, "Witnesses to how the children trembled every time their father's name was mentioned." One by one, the neighbors raised their voices, sharing small fragments of what they had observed since the arrival of Lola and her children. How Margarita hid behind her mother's skirts when seeing unknown men. How Sebastián had flourished under Francisco's patient tutelage. How Josefina, just 13, cared for her siblings with a maturity forced by circumstances. Commissioner Suarez was beginning to show signs of discomfort, looking alternately at Gervasio and the gathered crowd. "The documents are in order," he insisted, though with less conviction. "The law is clear regarding paternal rights." "The law also speaks of protecting the defenseless," intervened Francisco, who until then had remained silent. "Of safeguarding the welfare of children above. All—" Gervasio looked at him with barely contained contempt. "And what would you know of children, Sarmiento, you, who live alone like an animal in this cabin away from everyone?" A tense silence followed these words. Lola saw how Francisco's shoulders tensed, how his hands closed into fists at his sides. For an instant, she feared he would respond with violence, that the situation would escalate to a point of no return. But when Francisco spoke, his voice was controlled, though vibrating with contained emotion. "I had a son, Gervasio, a son whom I loved more than my own life. Fever took him from me along with my wife. I know what it means to be a father. It's not her title you claim when convenient. It's a responsibility you live every day in small and great actions." Lola felt tears come to her eyes at the intensity with which Francisco pronounced each word. Around her, several neighbors nodded in silence, moved. Gervasio seemed momentarily disarmed, but rage soon returned to his face. "Enough talk," he exclaimed, taking a step toward Lola. "I've come for my children, and my wife and I have the law on my side." At that moment, the cabin door opened and Sebastian ran out, followed by Josefina, who was trying to stop him. "You are not our father," shouted the boy, placing himself in front of Gervasio, with a courage that made Lola feel simultaneous pride and terror. A father doesn't abandon his children. A father doesn't make his mother cry every night. Gervasio raised his hand in a gesture that all present recognized too well. Before it could descend upon the child, Francisco intervened, grasping his wrist firmly. "Don't even think about it," he said, with a calm that was more threatening than any shout. For a moment it seemed Gervasio would lunge at Francisco. His companions took a step forward, but stopped when they saw the men of the town do the same. Commissioner Suarez, perceiving that the situation could get out of control, intervened. "Mr. Vega, perhaps we should reconsider this," he said nervously, looking at the crowd. "The opinion of the community is significant in these matters." Lawyer Peralta, with the survival instinct typical of his profession, began to slowly retreat toward his horse. Gervasio looked around, seeing how the support he believed he had was crumbling. His face reddened with humiliation and rage. "This is not over," he growled, pointing an accusing finger at Lola. "Remember that you remain my wife before God." "Doña." Carmen stepped forward, her small figure, but imposing in her dignity. "God sees beyond papers, Gervasio Vega," she said in a clear voice. "He sees the heart of people, their actions, their true intentions. And what he sees in you, boy, I don't think pleases him too much." A murmur of approval ran through the crowd. Gervasio, understanding that he had lost this battle, retreated toward his horse. "Let's go," he ordered his companions, "but it won't be the last time you see me." As they mounted and moved away along the same path they had come, Sebastian ran to Francisco, embracing his waist. The man, visibly moved, placed a hand on the boy's head in a protective gesture. Lola, with her heart still beating rapidly, approached them both. Her eyes met Francisco's over Sebastian's head, and in them she saw reflected the same emotional storm that shook her own interior. Gradually, the neighbors began to approach, offering words of encouragement and support. The tension gradually yielded, transforming into a kind of spontaneous celebration. Someone brought a guitar, another took freshly baked bread and homemade wine from one of the carts. As she watched how the community gathered in an improvised party in front of the cabin, Lola felt that something inside her loosened like a knot that begins to untie after having been too tight for too long. For the first time in a long time, the shadow of fear retreated, giving way to something that notably resembled hope. Francisco approached her, offering her a glass of wine. "I don't think he'll return soon," he said in a low voice. "Shame is a powerful deterrent." Lola nodded, though a part of her knew that Gervasio was not a man to give up easily. "Thank you," she responded, her voice barely audible above the conversations and laughter surrounding them. "For being willing to confront him. For protecting my children." Francisco gently shook his head. "I didn't do it just for your children," he admitted, his eyes fixed on hers with an intensity that made Lola feel a sudden heat in her cheeks. Before she could respond, Margarita came running with the blue ribbon that Doña Carmen had given her, waving in her hair. "Mom, Francisco," she exclaimed with childish enthusiasm. "Doña Carmen says there's going to be dancing." Francisco smiled, a genuine smile that transformed his usually serious face, illuminating it from within. "Then we'd better not keep her waiting," he responded, offering a hand to Lola in a gesture that was both an invitation and a promise. She took it, feeling how his rough but warm palm enveloped hers with delicacy. In the midst of that improvised celebration, under the infinite sky of Patagonia, something was beginning to flourish between them, something fragile and powerful at once, like the first shoots that dare to emerge after the long winter. The weeks following the confrontation passed with an almost unreal tranquility. Spring advanced decisively over Patagonia, melting the last vestiges of snow and awakening colors that had remained dormant during the long winter. Wildflowers, small but resilient, began to dot the slopes with purple, yellow, and white tones. The air gradually filled with the buzzing of insects and the song of birds returning after their annual migration. Life in the cabin had acquired a comforting routine. Francisco had fulfilled his promise to prepare the small back room for the children, building wooden bunks for Sebastian and Josefina, with his hands, and a smaller bed for Margarita. With fabric pieces that Doña Carmen had given them, Lola had made colorful curtains and quilts that transformed the austere space into a cozy corner. That morning in late September, Lola was in the small garden she had begun to cultivate next to the cabin. Her hands, which now showed some marks of constant work, moved skillfully among the lettuce and carrot sprouts. The warm sun caressed her face as she softly hummed a song from her childhood. Sebastian and Francisco had departed, at dawn, for the nearby forest in search of suitable wood for a project they kept secret. Josefina was in town helping in the small school that Father Tomas had organized, in a room annexed to the church. Margarita played near the garden with small wooden figures that Francisco had carved for her. Lola paused, straightening her back. To relieve the tension, she looked around amazed at how her life had changed in just a few months, from desperation in the midst of the storm to this daily peace, from the threat of losing her children to the security they now felt. And at the center of that transformation was Francisco, the silent and strong man, whose presence had become as essential as the air she breathed. The sound of approaching hooves startled her. Instinctively, her body tensed the memory of Gervasio, emerging like a shadow. But turning toward the road, she saw one of the young men from the village, Pablo, the blacksmith's son, approaching on horseback. "Good morning, Mrs. Lola," greeted the young man, dismounting with agility. "I bring a letter for you." Lola wiped her hands on her apron, intrigued. Almost no one wrote to her. She had no family beyond her children and the cousin in New Ken with whom she had not maintained contact for years. "Thank you, Pablo," she replied, taking the envelope the young man extended to her. The paper was fine, of good quality, not the type of material that usually circulated in these parts. Her name was written in an elegant but trembling calligraphy. She didn't recognize the handwriting, but something in it seemed disturbingly familiar. "It arrived yesterday at the post office," explained Pablo. "My father was passing by and offered to bring it, but he had to go to Mr. Fuentes' estate on an urgent errand, so he asked me to deliver it." Lola nodded, thanking the young man again, who, after politely declining her offer of a glass of water, mounted and trotted away. With slightly trembling fingers, Lola opened the envelope. The letter was brief, barely a page, but its content made her heart stop for an instant. "Lola, I don't expect your forgiveness, nor do I deserve it. The years of alcohol and bitterness have taken me to a place from which there is no return. The doctor says my liver is failing, that I have weeks, perhaps days left. Before departing, I would like to see my children one last time, not to claim them, that right I lost long ago. Just to say goodbye, to ask their forgiveness, though I know they are too young to truly understand what that means. I formally renounce any claim over them. I have signed the necessary documents which I attached to this letter. They are yours, they always were. I was just an intruder in their lives. If you decide to allow me this last visit, I will be at the inn in San Antonio del Sur for 3 days. If you don't come, I will understand. Some debts cannot be paid with words. Gervasio." Lola read the letter several times, unable to believe what her eyes were seeing. Was it possible that Gervasio, the man who had threatened to take her children away just a few weeks ago, now renounced them? That he asked forgiveness? That he recognized his faults? She reviewed the attached documents. They were official papers, drafted by a lawyer from Bariloche, where Gervasio formally renounced paternal rights over Josefina Sebastian and Margarita Vega. "Mom, who was that man?" Margarita's voice brought her back to the present. Lola quickly folded the letter, storing it in the pocket of her apron. "Just Pablo, the blacksmith's son, bringing a message," she replied, trying to make her voice sound normal. "Are you hungry, my darling? Would you like to prepare something for when Sebastian and Francisco return?" The child nodded enthusiastically, immediately forgetting the topic of the letter in favor of the prospect of helping cook. For the rest of the morning, Lola worked mechanically, her mind occupied by contradictory thoughts. Should she allow Gervasio to see the children? Would it be cruel to deny this last request to a dying man, or would it be cruelty to expose her children to a farewell they might not understand from a father they barely remembered with affection? When Francisco and Sebastian returned at noon, carrying carefully selected lenga logs, Lola had made a decision. She waited until the children were occupied to speak with Francisco in private, showing him the letter. Francisco read it in silence, his face impassive but his eyes revealing the storm of emotions the written words provoked in him. "Do you think he's telling the truth?" he finally asked, returning the letter to her. "About his illness." Lola sighed, running a hand through her hair in a nervous gesture. "I don't know," she admitted. "Gervasio was always skilled at manipulation, but these documents, they are official. I don't see what he would gain by legally renouncing the children if it were a trick." Francisco nodded slowly, his eyes fixed on the horizon, as if seeking answers in the distant mountains. "What do you plan to do?" he asked softly. "I think I should allow him to see the children," Lola replied, surprising herself with the firmness in her voice. "Not for him, but for them, so that in the future, when they are older and understand, they will know that I didn't deny them the opportunity to say goodbye to their father." Francisco remained silent for a moment, his profile outlined against the noon light. When he spoke, his voice contained an emotion he rarely let show. "When Elena and Matthias fell ill, the fever consumed them so quickly that I barely had time to say goodbye," he said, his gaze lost in painful memories. "I would give anything to have had that opportunity, a proper farewell." Lola felt her heart shrink at that revelation. Instinctively, she extended her hand to take Francisco's, their fingers intertwined in a gesture that was both comfort and promise. "I'll go to town tomorrow," she decided. "I'll speak with him first, see his condition, his sincerity. If everything seems genuine, I'll bring the children in the afternoon." That night during dinner, Lola observed her children with renewed intensity, as if wanting to imprint every gesture, every expression in her memory. How would they react to the news that their father was ill, dying? How to explain to them that the man they had feared now asked forgiveness? When she finally told them, seated by the fire after dinner, the reactions were as diverse as their personalities. Josefina listened in silence, her face a mask of contained emotions. Sebastian frowned, declaring that he did not want to see that man. Margarita, too young to truly understand, innocently asked if her father would bring them gifts like before, when they all still lived together. "You don't have to see him if you don't want to," Lola clarified, stroking Sebastian's hair. "It's your decision, but I want you to know that he is repentant, that he has recognized his mistakes." "And that erases everything he did?" asked Josefina with a tense voice. "The nights you cried when you thought we were asleep, the blows you hid with long sleeves in the middle of summer." Lola felt the air leave her lungs. She had never imagined that Josefina, at just 13, had been so aware of the situation they lived in. "No, my child," she replied gently. "Nothing erases the past. But forgiveness is not for the one who receives it, but for the one who grants. It frees us from carrying the weight of resentment." Josefina lowered her gaze, reflecting on these words. Finally, with a maturity that far exceeded her age, she said, "I'll go with you, not for him, but for myself, to be able to move forward without that shadow." Sebastian, influenced by his older sister's decision, also agreed to accompany them, though with evident reluctance. Margarita simply nodded, more interested in the adventure of traveling to town than in the purpose of the visit. The next morning, as Lola prepared to depart for San Antonio del Sur, Francisco approached her with a small package wrapped in cloth. "For you," he said with the simplicity that characterized him. "Open it when you're alone." Intrigued, Lola kept the package in her bag, thanking him with a smile that Francisco briefly returned. The journey to town passed in relative silence, each family member immersed in their own thoughts. Lola left the children in Doña Carmen's care, who had been informed of the situation and received them with her usual warmth, promising stories and sweets to distract them. The inn at San Antonio del Sur was a modest two-story building constructed with logs and stone. Lola entered with her heart beating rapidly, asking for Gervasio Vega from the innkeeper, a bald, robust man named Anselmo. Room 3 at the end of 2. The hallway, the man indicated, looking at her with curiosity. "He's quite ill, Mum. The doctor was here this morning." Lola nodded, thanking him for the information. With steps that tried to be firm but betrayed her nervousness, she walked down the hallway to the indicated room. She knocked softly on the door, and a weak voice from inside invited her to enter. The image she found inside hit her like a physical blow. Gervasio, the man who had once been strong and vigorous, lay in bed like a shadow of himself. His face was emaciated with yellowish skin stretched over the bones. His eyes, which Lola remembered as vivacious and seductive in the past, now shone momentarily upon recognizing her. "Lola," he murmured, trying to sit up without success. "You came." She remained near the door, unable to approach further. The smell of illness and decay permeated the room, mingling with the more subtle aroma of medicines. "Your letter," she finally said when she found her voice. "The documents—" Gervasio made a weak gesture with his hand. "All legitimate," he confirmed. "I no longer have rights over them, nor over you." An uncomfortable silence settled between them, charged with the weight of years of suffering, of lost opportunities, of divergent paths that should never have crossed. "Why now?" Lola finally asked the question that had been burning inside her since receiving the letter. Gervasio briefly closed his eyes as if gathering strength to answer. "Because death has a peculiar way of clearing one's vision," he replied, with a bitter smile. "When you know you have little time left, the lies you've told yourself all your life no longer serve as consolation." Lola took a cautious step toward the bed, studying the face of the man she had once loved with the naivety of youth. "The children are in town," she said, "with Doña Carmen, if you really want to see them." A solitary tear slid down Gervasio's sunken cheek. "Thank you," he murmured. "It's more than I deserve." As she left the room to fetch her children, Lola remembered the package Francisco had given her. She opened it in the privacy of the empty hallway. Inside was a small wood carving, a woman standing with 3 small figures around her. The features were minimalist, but unmistakable. It was her with her children, and on the base, carved with careful precision, were the words, "Where fire is born." Lola felt tears come to her eyes as she understood the meaning of that gift. Francisco had seen in her what she herself was just beginning to recognize: her strength, her ability to create a home, a warm refuge for her children in the midst of adversity. With the small sculpture safely stored in her bag again like a talisman that would give her courage, she went in search of her children for the encounter that would definitively close a chapter of her life. The news arrived 3 days later. Gervasio Vega had died at dawn while returning to Bariloche after his meeting with the children. His body, found by some muleteers on the road, showed the serenity he had never possessed in life. Lola received the information with a strange mixture of emotions. It wasn't pain she felt, but a kind of conclusion, like when one closes a book, whose story, though important, already belongs to the past. The children reacted with the solemnity typical of those who face concepts too large for their complete understanding. Even Margarita, who barely remembered her father before the abandonment, showed an unusual stillness during the hours that followed. Francisco, always attentive to the mood changes in the small family that now shared his home, suggested a small ritual. "Sometimes," he said that afternoon as they sat by the fire after dinner, "we need to say goodbye properly in order to continue." The next day, he guided Lola and the children to a clearing by the stream that ran near the cabin. The place, bathed in the golden light of sunset, seemed enveloped in an almost magical atmosphere. Francisco had prepared a small bonfire, and on a flat rock nearby he had placed 4 pieces of paper and pencils. "Each of you can write or draw something you wish to tell Gervasio," he explained simply. "Something you wanted to express and couldn't, or simply a goodbye. Then we'll burn it in the bonfire, and the smoke will carry our messages toward the sky." Josefina was the first to take a paper. In careful handwriting, she wrote for several minutes, her contained emotions manifesting in the pressure she exerted on the pencil. Sebastian, after initially hesitating, drew something he kept hidden from the others. Margarita, too young to write fluently, made a colorful drawing that seemed to represent human figures under a bright sun. Lola contemplated her blank paper, not knowing exactly what to express. What does one say to the man who was both the father of your children and your tormentor, to the one you loved and feared in equal measure. Finally, with a trembling hand, she wrote a single phrase, "Rest in peace, Gervasio, I forgive you." One by one they approached their papers to the fire. The flames quickly devoured the words and drawings, transforming them into ashes that rose toward the sky, tinged with purple and gold. As they watched the smoke ascend and disperse, Lola felt a lightness in her heart, as if a weight she had carried for years finally detached from her. Sebastian, who had remained particularly silent, approached Francisco, and without a word, took his hand. The man looked at the boy with momentary surprise, then squeezed those small fingers between his own. A tacit understanding seemed to have been born between them. On the way back to the cabin under a sky that was beginning to be sprinkled with stars, Lola walked a few steps behind, observing Francisco with her 3 children. Josefina was asking him something about the constellations, which he answered with his characteristic patience. Margarita, tired, had insisted he carry her, and now rested her head against Francisco's shoulder with absolute trust. Sebastian walked close by occasionally, pointing out something on the path that caught his attention. The image awakened in Lola an emotion so intense that she felt her chest could barely contain it. This was what she had always dreamed of, without knowing exactly how to name it, a family. United not by obligation or circumstance, but by a genuine affection that grew day by day like the plants in her small garden. That night, when the children finally fell asleep, Lola found Francisco sitting on the porch contemplating the starry sky. Without a word, she sat beside him, letting the silence speak for them. Their shoulders brushed slightly, a subtle contact, but charged with meaning. "Thank you," she finally said, her voice barely audible over the night song of the crickets. "For today, for everything." Francisco nodded slightly, his eyes still fixed on the stars that dotted the Patagonian firmament. "When I lost Elena and Matthias," he replied after a moment, "no one taught me how to say goodbye. Pain became a constant companion, one I didn't know how to let go." Lola looked at him, then studying his profile outlined against the night. The lines of his face, once hard, as if carved in stone, seemed to have gradually softened in recent months. "And now?" she asked unknowingly, repeating the same question she had asked him that day in the cart, when they barely knew each other. Francisco turned toward her, and in his eyes shone something new, something that made Lola's heart accelerate. "Now I understand that honoring their memory doesn't mean clinging to pain," he answered with simplicity. "It means allowing myself to live again, to feel again." Their hands found each other on the wooden bench, naturally intertwining like branches of trees that grow together. There was no need for more words. Under the starry mantle of Patagonia, 2 hearts wounded by life recognized in each other the possibility of a new beginning. October advanced with the promise of warmer days. The tree buds unfolded like small green miracles, and wildflowers dotted the hillsides previously dominated by snow and stone with colors. Life teemed in every corner of Patagonia, as if all of nature celebrated its rebirth after the long winter lethargy. In the cabin by Lake Laca, the changes were no less significant. Francisco, with Sebastian's enthusiastic help, had begun to build an extension, 2 additional rooms that would allow greater comfort for everyone. Josefina spent more and more time in town, attending the small school where she now not only helped, but began to teach the younger children under Father Tomas's tutelage. Margarita had discovered a fascination with plants and followed Lola like a shadow as she tended the garden that now provided much of their food. That mid-month morning, Lola was kneeling between the furrows, teaching Margarita how to identify useful herbs from weeds. The warm sun caressed their faces, and a gentle breeze swayed the dark hair of both. "Why this plant yes and this one no?" asked the child, pointing to 2 apparently similar sprouts. Lola smiled, taking both plants delicately. "Look carefully, my darling," she explained. "This one has more rounded leaves and a particular aroma when you rub it between your fingers. It's mint. It will give us a delicious tea. The other, although it looks similar, doesn't have that aroma. It could rob us of nutrients without giving anything in return." Margarita nodded seriously, absorbing the lesson with that intensity typical of children when something truly interests them. Lola observed her, tenderly amazed at how her younger daughter, once so shy and fearful, flourished day by day in this new environment. The sound of approaching hooves made them turn toward the road. It was Josefina riding the mare that Francisco had taught her to ride. Her adolescent face reflected a mixture of pride and excitement as she dismounted with growing skill. "Mom," she called, approaching hurriedly. "Father Tomas has entrusted me with the youngest children to teach them their letters. He says I have patience and clarity in explaining." Lola stood up, cleaning the dirt from her hands on her apron before embracing her eldest daughter. She could feel how Josefina grew not only in stature, but in confidence and determination. "I'm proud of you," she said, moving away to look into her eyes. "I always knew you were special, that you had much to offer." A pleased blush colored Josefina's cheeks, who immediately began to relate the details of her first day as an assistant teacher. Margarita listened with evident admiration to her older sister, occasionally interrupting with enthusiastic questions. As she watched them interact, Lola felt a wave of gratitude so intense it almost made her dizzy. Her children were healing, growing, finding their own paths. The constant fear that had been her companion for so long gradually faded, giving way to a hope that strengthened with each dawn. From the shed came the rhythmic sounds of hammers and saws. Francisco and Sebastian were working on the new rooms, their labor occasionally accompanied by songs that the boy had learned in town, and now taught to the man. Francisco's deep voice blended with Sebastian's childish one, creating an imperfect but moving harmony. "Let's take them water," suggested Lola, getting up. "With this heat, they must be thirsty." The three headed toward the shed, where they found Francisco and Sebastian installing beams for the roof. The boy, perched on the man's shoulders, was hammering with absolute concentration while Francisco held him firmly. "Careful workers," called Lola, holding a jug of fresh water. "We bring provisions." Sebastian, seeing them, waved the hammer in an enthusiastic greeting that almost made him lose his balance. Francisco lowered him carefully, and both approached, their faces shining with sweat and their hands calloused from constant work. "Just in time," said Francisco, gratefully accepting the glass Lola offered him. "The master builder here was wearing me out." Sebastian puffed out his chest with pride at the barely disguised compliment. At 10 years old, the boy had found in Francisco a role model, a man whose strength was matched by his gentleness, whose hands could be firm holding an axe or delicate carving figures for Margarita. "We're advancing quickly," informed Sebastian, drinking eagerly. "Francisco says by the end of the month we can have the walls raised. And by then," added Francisco, "the snow will have retreated enough in the northern hills to go look for clay. We'll need to plaster the walls." Josefina, who had been observing the structure with interest, approached to study the rudimentary plans that Francisco had drawn on a piece of cured leather. "Will this be my room?" she asked, pointing to one of the marked spaces. Francisco nodded, explaining the details of the design. Soon all five were leaning over the plans, discussing possibilities, suggesting improvements, imagining together the home they were building, not just with wood and mud, but with shared dreams and hopes. That night, after an abundant dinner prepared by Lola and Josefina, they remained longer than usual by the fire. Outside, a light drizzle pattered on the cabin's roof, creating a relaxing music that invited calm conversation. Francisco was carving a small figure, while Sebastian watched him attentively, trying to imitate his movements with his own piece of wood. Margarita had succumbed to sleep and was curled up like a kitten in a corner of the bench, her head resting in Josefina's lap, who was reading in a low voice a book that Father Tomas had lent her. Lola, seated by the fire, was knitting a shawl with wool that Doña Carmen had given her. Her fingers moved with learned skill, while her mind wandered through paths of memories and possibilities. "Next Sunday there's a celebration in town," commented Francisco without raising his eyes from his carving. "The spring festival. I thought perhaps we would like to go." There was an unusual shyness in his voice, as if he were proposing something much more significant than a simple outing. Lola looked at him, catching the almost imperceptible blush that colored his usually pale cheeks. "I would love to," she replied, simply, but the smile that accompanied her words contained promises that transcended the present moment. Josefina, who apparently wasn't as absorbed in her reading as she seemed, looked up with a knowing expression that made Lola look away suddenly. aware that her eldest daughter perceived more than she let on. "Doña Carmen says there will be music and dancing," commented the young girl with feigned innocence, "and that traditionally couples who dance together at the spring festival are said to have good fortune." Francisco coughed slightly, concentrating with renewed intensity on his carving. Sebastian, oblivious to the subtle currents flowing between the adults, asked enthusiastically if there would be games and competitions. "Surely," replied Francisco, visibly grateful for the change of subject. "Last year, there were horse races and an archery contest." As the conversation drifted toward the details of the celebration, Lola contemplated Francisco over her knitting. Something was changing between them, something as delicate and promising as the first buds of spring. Something that neither of them yet dared to name, but which blossomed silently with each shared glance, with each accidental touch, with each complicit silence. Outside, the spring rain continued to fall, nourishing the reborn earth. Inside, 4 hearts beat at an increasingly synchronized rhythm, like different instruments learning to create music together. The day of the spring festival dawned radiant, as if the sky itself wanted to contribute to the celebration. An intense blue stretched to the horizon, barely interrupted by some white clouds lazily pushed by a warm breeze. In the cabin, the excitement was palpable. The children had awakened with the first light, unable to contain their enthusiasm at the prospect of a whole day of festivities in town. Lola, who had worked in secret during the week, took out from a chest 3 outfits. She had made a cotton dress with simple embroidery for Josefina, a new shirt for Sebastian, and for Margarita, a dress with ruffles and a ribbon that matched the one Doña Carmen had given her months ago. "They're beautiful, Mom," exclaimed Josefina, touching the fabric of her dress with reverence. "When did you make them?" "In my free time," replied Lola, pleased by her children's reaction. "I wanted you to have something special for today." While the children prepared, Lola took out her own dress, the only one she had managed to keep from her previous life. It was simple, but elegant, of a deep blue that highlighted the olive tone of her skin and the intense black of her hair. She had stored it carefully, wrapping it in fabric to protect it as a reminder that not all of her past had to be forgotten or denied. She dressed with care, paying an attention to her appearance that she hadn't allowed herself for months. She combed her long hair, partially gathering it with pins that Doña Carmen had lent her, letting some curls frame her face. With slightly trembling fingers, she applied to her cheeks a little of the natural dye she had prepared with wild rose petals. When she emerged from the small room she used to change, she found Francisco waiting by the door. He too had taken pains with his appearance. His hair, usually disheveled, was combed back, and he wore a clean shirt under a dark woolen vest. He had trimmed his beard more clearly, revealing the contours of his face. Their eyes met across the room, and for an instant, the world seemed to stop. Lola felt her heart skip a beat upon noticing the way Francisco's gaze traveled over her, with a mixture of admiration and something deeper that neither of them yet dared to name. "You're—" he began, then stopped as if words were insufficient. "You too," she replied, perfectly understanding what had been left unsaid. Margarita's enthusiastic exclamation upon seeing her mother so dressed up broke the moment, but the current that had flowed between them remained like an invisible thread connecting them across the room. The journey to San Antonio del Sur passed, amidst songs and laughter. The children, dressed in their new clothes, overflowed with a contagious joy that enveloped even Francisco, usually reserved. Lola observed him from the corner of her eye, marveling at the transformation of the solitary and taciturn man who had received them that stormy night. Now he laughed openly at Sebastian's occurrences, patiently answered Margarita's endless questions, discussed literature with Josefina. The town had been transformed for the occasion. The central plaza, dominated by the centenary ombu tree, was decorated with colored ribbons that waved in the wind. Long tables covered with white tablecloths extended under the tree's shade, laden with food and drink that the neighbors had contributed. A group of musicians prepared in a corner, tuning instruments and sharing drinks of wine between laughs. As soon as they arrived, they were warmly received. Doña Carmen, dressed in a black dress that highlighted the whiteness of her hair, gathered in a high bun, welcomed them with effusive hugs. Father Thomas, who had officiated a special mass in the morning, approached to greet them, his usually serious face illuminated by a genuine smile. "Look who has decided to honor us with their presence," exclaimed Pedro Mendez, approaching with his wife Rosario. Francisco Sarmiento and his family. Who would have thought a few months ago? Lola noticed that Francisco didn't correct the assumption that they formed a family. Instead, he gently placed a hand on the small of her back, a protective and deeply intimate gesture. The celebration was in full swing. Children ran between tables, participating in improvised games. Men competed in tests of strength and skill, throwing horseshoes or arm wrestling that triggered friendly bets. Women exchanged recipes and news, watching their children with eagle eyes while pretending to be completely absorbed in their conversations. Lola found herself surrounded by a group of women from town who, having overcome the initial curiosity about the foreigner, had accepted her as one of their own. The blacksmith's wife asked her advice on how she had managed to grow such beautiful lettuces in her garden. The baker's daughter begged her to teach her to embroider, as she had done on Josefina's dress. From her position, she could see Francisco conversing with other men near the food tables. From time to time, their gazes crossed across the plaza, and each visual encounter sent an electric current down Lola's spine. In the middle of the afternoon, when the sun was beginning its lazy descent toward the horizon, the musicians started a cheerful melody. Couples of all ages gathered in the center of the plaza, forming concentric circles that spun to the rhythm of guitars, violins, and an accordion. That Pablo the blacksmith's son played with surprising skill. "Come on, Francisco," exclaimed Pedro Mendez, pushing him friendly toward the circle. "Show us if you know how to dance or if you're only good with wood." A general laugh greeted the comment. Francisco, visibly uncomfortable, was shaking his head when his gaze found Lola's across the crowd. Something in his eyes, a silent question, a timid offering, made her stand up and approach slowly. "I don't know if I remember how it's done," murmured Francisco when she reached his side. "I'll guide you," replied Lola with a smile, taking his hand. They entered the circle of dancers as the music changed to a slower, more cadenced tune. Francisco's hands found their place on Lola's waist, hers rested on his shoulders. At first their movements were awkward, unsure, but gradually they found a common rhythm, a silent language that their bodies learned together. "The last time I danced was at my wedding to Elena," Francisco confessed in a low voice just for her ears. "I thought I would never do it again." Lola looked into his eyes, finding in them not the sadness she expected, but a mixture of serene nostalgia and renewed hope. "Life has strange paths," she replied. "It takes us through painful roads to then gift us unexpected views." The music enveloped them, creating an intimate space amidst the celebration. Their bodies imperceptibly drew closer, with each turn dissolving the physical and emotional distances they had maintained for months. "When I found you that night," said Francisco, his words barely audible above the music, "I didn't know that I was also finding myself." Lola felt her heart painfully expand at that confession offered with such simplicity. Without thinking, she brought her face closer to his, until their foreheads touched in a gesture as intimate as a kiss. "And we found not just a refuge," she replied, "but a home." They continued dancing as the sun set, tinting the sky with golden and purple hues. Around them, other couples twirled and laughed, but in their shared small universe, only the two of them existed, their hands intertwined, their bodies moving as if they had been created to complement each other. From the edge of the plaza, Josefina observed her mother and Francisco with a comprehending smile that made her seem much older than her 13 years. Sebastian at her side slightly furrowed his brow, processing in his own way what he saw. Margarita, seated on Father Tomas's shoulders, who had offered to hold her so she could see better, clapped enthusiastically. "Is Francisco going to be our new daddy?" asked the child with that disconcerting candor typical of childhood. Father Tomas smiled, looking at the couple dancing in the center of the plaza, oblivious to the world surrounding them. "I believe, little one," he responded softly, "that in many ways he already is." Night had completely fallen when they set out for the return to the cabin. The children, exhausted from a day of games and emotions, dozed in the back of the cart. Lola and Francisco sat at the front, their shoulders and hips touching slightly with the vehicle's swaying. The starry sky unfolded above them, like a mantle of black velvet sprinkled with diamonds. The nearly full moon bathed the landscape with its silver light, transforming the familiar contours into ethereal silhouettes. They traveled in a complicit silence, each immersed in their own thoughts that without knowing it ran along parallel paths. When the cabin finally appeared before them, a strange sensation seized Lola, that of returning not to a temporary refuge, but to a true home. Francisco stopped the cart in front of the entrance. Carefully he took Margarita in his arms, while Lola gently awakened Josefina and Sebastian. They brought them inside, helped them change, and tucked them into their beds, where they fell back into a deep sleep almost immediately. When they left the children's room, Lola and Francisco found themselves alone in the main room, illuminated only by the dying glow of the embers in the fireplace. A sweet tension charged with possibilities floated between them. "It was a beautiful day," said Lola, breaking the silence. Francisco nodded his eyes, reflecting the reddish gleam of the embers. "The first of many, I hope," he replied, his deep voice charged with an emotion he no longer tried to hide. They looked at each other through the twilight, all the unspoken words suspended in the air between them like fireflies. Lola took a step toward him, eliminating the physical distance separating them. With an audacity born of certainty, she placed a hand on his chest, feeling beneath her palm the accelerated beating of his heart. "Francisco," she murmured his name, a caress on her lips. He covered her hand with his own, rough but infinitely gentle. "I don't want to rush anything," he said, his eyes seeking hers in the semi-darkness. "You and the children deserve time security." Lola gently shook her head, silencing his words with a finger on his lips. "Time is a precious gift," she replied, "and we have both lost too much already." With an almost reverential delicacy, Francisco took her face between his hands, like one who holds something infinitely valuable and fragile. He leaned down slowly, giving her time to step back if she so desired. But Lola remained motionless, her heart beating so strongly that she feared he might hear it. When their lips finally met, it was as if two separated pieces of a whole came back together. The kiss, initially shy, gradually deepened, charged with the weight of past stories and future promises. Outside, a shooting star crossed the Patagonian sky, leaving behind a luminous trail that vanished in the immensity of the night. Inside the cabin, two souls that had known the deepest pain discovered together that after the harshest winter, spring always comes. November presented itself with an exuberant display of life. The Patagonian fields, finally liberated from the winter cold, exploded in colors, purples and yellows of wildflowers, intense greens of new shoots, deep blues of lakes, reflecting an increasingly clear sky. The cabin had changed notably. The expansion, on which Francisco and Sebastian had worked for weeks, was almost finished. Two new rooms with windows that let in light and fresh air had been added to the original structure. The walls, freshly plastered with a mixture of clay, sand and straw, exhaled a pleasant, earthy aroma. Lola had made curtains with fabrics bought in town, adding touches of color that transformed the austere space into a welcoming place. But the most significant changes were not the visible ones. Since that night after the spring festival, something new had blossomed between Lola and Francisco. A tender familiarity, made of complicit glances, seemingly casual touches, conversations in low voices when the children slept. They hadn't put names to what they shared, hadn't made grandiloquent declarations. They simply allowed their relationship to evolve naturally, like a river that finds its course without need of maps. That morning, Francisco had left early for town, taking Sebastian with him, who lately accompanied him everywhere. He had mentioned something about materials needed to finish the roof of the expansion, but a spark in his eyes had awakened Lola's curiosity. She took advantage of the morning to work in the garden with Margarita, while Josefina practiced the lesson she would impart the next day to the town's children. The warm sun caressed their faces, while their hands moved between the earth and the plants, pulling unwanted weeds, watering the crops that promised an abundant harvest. "Mom," called Margarita, her childish voice interrupting Lola's thoughts. "Can I ask something?" "Of course, my darling," she replied, wiping the sweat from her forehead with the back of her hand. "Does Francisco love us like a father?" asked the child with that disconcerting frankness of 5-year-olds. Lola felt her heart skip a beat. She had expected this question or something similar, but even so it caught her off guard. "Why do you ask?" she inquired gently, buying time to organize her thoughts. Margarita shrugged distractedly, pulling a lettuce leaf. "Because he tells me stories before bed, like you say fathers do," she explained with childish logic. "And he teaches Sebastian to build things, and he helps Josefina with her books, and he looks at you like Mr. Mendez looks at Mrs. Rosario." Lola smiled at her youngest daughter's sharpness. Children saw clearly what adults sometimes strove to complicate. "I think he does," she answered honestly. "Francisco loves us all very much, and we love him. So is he going to be our real father?" insisted Margarita with the persistence characteristic of her age. Before Lola could respond, Josefina approached from the cabin. She had heard the conversation and now observed her mother with a mixture of curiosity and something deeper, more mature. "I would like that," said the teenager, surprising Lola with her frankness. "Francisco is all different. He really listens to us, and he makes you smile." Lola felt tears come to her eyes at her eldest daughter's words. She extended her arms, and Josefina, despite being at that age when maternal hugs begin to become embarrassing, approached to let herself be embraced. "I don't want to replace anyone," said Lola softly. "Gervasio, despite everything, was your father. But Francisco is the one who saved us," replied Josefina with surprising maturity. "From the storm, from Gervasio, from being left homeless. And he saved you too, Mom, from sadness." Margarita joined the embrace, her small arms surrounding the legs of both. For a perfect moment, they remained thus united under the warm November sun, surrounded by the flourishing garden that symbolized their own renewal. The sound of the returning cart separated them. Sebastian jumped from the vehicle even before it had completely stopped running toward them, with an expression of jubilation. "Mom," he exclaimed, stopping briefly to catch his breath. "Francisco has a surprise, but it's a secret, and I promised not to say anything." Francisco descended from the cart more calmly, carrying several packages. His face, usually serious, reflected a mixture of nervousness and determination that Lola found intriguing. "What new things do you bring?" she asked, approaching to help with the packages. "What's needed to finish the roof?" he replied, though his eyes avoided hers, directly confirming her suspicions that there was something more. The rest of the day passed in an atmosphere of barely contained anticipation. Sebastian exchanged complicit glances with Francisco, barely able to contain the secret they evidently shared. Josefina observed the situation with a knowing smile, while Margarita fluttered among them, all absorbing the general excitement without completely understanding its origin. As evening fell, when Lola was busy preparing dinner, Francisco approached her. There was something in his posture, a mixture of resolution and vulnerability, that made her stop what she was doing to give him her full attention. "I would like to speak with you," he said, his voice deeper than usual. "Alone, if possible." Intrigued, Lola nodded. They went out together to the porch, where the fresh evening air carried aromas of wildflowers and aromatic herbs from the nearby garden. The sun was slowly descending behind the mountains, tinting the sky with golden and reddish hues. Francisco remained silent for a moment, like someone gathering courage to jump into unknown waters. "When Elena and Matthias died," he finally began, his voice barely audible, "I thought I would never feel again. That part of me had gone with them. I took refuge in this cabin in solitude, accepting it as the only possible companion." He paused, his eyes fixed on the horizon, as if there he found the strength to continue. "And then on the coldest and darkest night you arrived," he continued. "And slowly, without even realizing it, you began to thaw something I thought lost forever." He turned to her then, and Lola saw in his eyes a vulnerability that took her breath away. "I love you, Lola," he said with devastating simplicity. "You and your children. I love you as if you were part of me, as if you had always been destined to be part of my life." He took from his pocket a small object wrapped in a piece of cloth. Upon unwrapping it, Lola saw a simple but beautiful ring, a silver band with small incrustations that seemed to represent stars. "I cannot offer you riches or an easy life," continued Francisco, holding the ring between his calloused fingers. "Only this piece of land, this cabin we built together, and my promise to love and protect you as long as I have breath." Lola felt tears spring from her eyes, silently sliding down her cheeks. They were not tears of sadness, but of a joy so intense, so complete that she could barely contain it. "Francisco," she began, but he gently interrupted her. "You don't have to answer now," he said. "I understand this is sudden, that perhaps you need time." Lola shook her head, silencing him with a hand on his lips. "I have loved you silently for months," she confessed. "Perhaps since that first night when you opened your door to strangers soaked by the storm." She took Francisco's face between her hands, looking directly into his eyes. "I accept your proposal, Francisco Sarmiento," she said with a clear and firm voice. "Not because I need a protector or a provider, but because I want to walk by your side for the rest of my life." The smile that illuminated Francisco's face transformed his features, softening the lines that pain and solitude had carved. With slightly trembling hands, he slid the ring onto Lola's finger. It fit perfectly, as if it had been created specifically for her. "The children already know," he confessed with a spark of humor in his eyes. "Sebastian helped me choose the silver. For the ring. The town's goldsmith owes me favors since I repaired his roof last year." Lola laughed, imagining her son seriously offering opinions on engagement rings. "And when do you plan for us to marry?" she asked, caressing the ring that now adorned her hand with her thumb. "Whenever you want," replied Francisco. "Tomorrow next month when the extension is finished." "How about when the first plum trees bloom?" suggested Lola. "At the end of this month. A simple ceremony right here with the people who have been part of our journey." Francisco nodded, drawing her to him in an embrace that was both protective and reverent. His lips found hers in a kiss that sealed the promise just made, a pact between two souls that had traversed the deepest pain to find unexpectedly a second chance. The news was received with enthusiasm in town. Doña Carmen self-proclaimed herself the main organizer of the celebration, recruiting several women to prepare food and decorations. Father Tomás, visibly pleased, offered to officiate the ceremony, although technically it would not be a formal religious marriage, given that Lola remained legally married to Gervasio despite his recent death. "It will be a blessing of union," explained the priest, "a recognition before God and the community of the bond that already exists between you." The days that followed passed in a whirlwind of preparations. The expansion of the cabin was finally completed with 2 new rooms and a wider porch where they could sit on warm nights to contemplate the stars. Lola worked on a simple but beautiful dress with Josefina's help, who showed a surprising ability with the needle. Francisco and Sebastian built rustic benches that would be placed under the large tree by the stream where they decided to hold the ceremony. The morning of the big day dawned clear and radiant, as if nature itself wanted to bless the union. The sky showed an intense blue without a single cloud to stain it. The plum trees, as Lola had foreseen, had begun to bloom, covering their bare branches with delicate white and pink flowers. From early on, neighbors from San Antonio del Sur began to arrive, bringing with them food, drink, music, and good wishes. They transformed the area near the stream into a festive but elegant space. Colored ribbons hung from tree branches, tables covered. With white tablecloths awaited the food, a small platform had been mounted for the musicians. Doña Carmen had installed herself in the cabin to help Lola with the final preparations. The old woman, dressed in her best black dress and a lace shawl that had belonged to her own mother, supervised every detail with the authority of one who has seen many lives develop under her care. "Your beautiful daughter," she said, contemplating Lola with evident approval. The dress she had made was a pale blue, almost white, with details embroidered in silver thread around the neck and sleeves. Her hair, partially gathered with silver combs lent by Rosario Mendez, fell in soft waves down her back. She wore no jewels other than the ring Francisco had given her. "Thank you, Doña Carmen," replied Lola, visibly moved, "for everything, for welcoming us when we were strangers, for supporting us when Gervasio returned." The old woman made a gesture, dismissing her words. "True family is not always blood, child," she replied with the wisdom that only years bestow. Sometimes it's the one we build with love and conscious choice. A knock at the door announced Josefina's arrival, dressed in a lavender-colored dress. That highlighted her incipient adolescent beauty. "Mom, everything is ready," she announced, her eyes bright with excitement. "Francisco is waiting by the stream with Father Tomas." Lola breathed deeply, feeling a mixture of nerves and absolute joy. She took her daughter's hands in hers, contemplating her with infinite love. "Are you happy with this, Josefina?" she asked, although she already knew the answer. "With Francisco, with our new life here?" The young girl nodded emphatically. "I had never seen you smile so much, Mom," she replied with simplicity. "And he truly loves us, not like—" She left the sentence unfinished, but it wasn't necessary to complete it. Both knew to whom she referred. Hand in hand, they left the cabin where Sebastian and Margarita waited. The boy, serious and dignified in his self-assigned role as main escort, offered his arm to his mother with a formality that drew smiles from those present. Margarita, charming in her white dress and a crown of wildflowers on her dark curls, walked, a head scattering plum blossom petals in her path. The path to the stream was flanked by neighbors who had come to share their joy. Smiling faces, words of encouragement, murmured blessings accompanied their advance. Lola felt a gratitude so deep it threatened to overwhelm her. And then she saw him, standing by the stream under the mottled shade of the great tree. Francisco waited for her, dressed with simple elegance, his face illuminated by an expression Lola had never seen before, pure, uncontainable happiness. At his side, Father Tomas held an ancient book, its pages yellowed by time. But it was not the Bible as Lola expected, but a volume of poetry that the priest had brought especially for the occasion. When Lola reached Francisco's side, he took her, hands with a reverence that moved her to the depths. His eyes, the color of spring sky, looked at her as if she were the only person in the world. Father Tomas smiled at those present, inviting them to form a circle around the couple. The children positioned themselves beside them, an essential part of the union being formalized. "We are gathered here," began the priest, "not only to witness but to participate in the union of these two beings who have found in each other not just love, but redemption and rebirth." He opened the poetry book, searching for a marked page. "Francisco asked me to read these words," he explained, "that express better than any liturgy what we celebrate today." With a clear and emotional voice he read, "Love how many paths until reaching a kiss, what wandering solitude until your company. Suddenly the tree of my life bursts into flowers, and hope instead of dreams nests in my heart." Lola felt tears come to her eyes upon recognizing the verses. It was a poem that Francisco had read to her one night by the fire when the children were already asleep, and they shared those precious moments of intimacy. "Francisco and Lola have chosen to forge a path together," continued Father Tomas. "Not as two beings who merge into one, losing their individuality, but as companions who sustain each other, respecting the stories that have formed them and building together a new chapter." At a sign from the priest, Francisco spoke, his voice deep but firm. "I, Francisco Sarmiento, choose you, Lola Quintana, as my companion, my equal, my love. I promise to honor you, respect you, support you in your dreams, and sustain you in your moments of weakness. I promise to be a father to your children, guide and friend protector, without smothering their spirit. I promise to build with you, day by day, a home where love is the fire that keeps us warm even on the coldest nights." Tears were already flowing freely down Lola's cheeks when she responded, "I, Lola Quintana, choose you, Francisco Sarmiento, as my companion, my equal, my love. I promise to honor you, respect you, be your support in moments of doubt and your celebration in those of joy. I promise to share with you the raising of my children, who are now also yours. I promise to remind you when the shadows of the past darken your gaze that you deserve all the light and happiness this world can offer." Father Tomas smiled visibly, moved. He extended his hands over the heads of the couple in a gesture of blessing. "May God, who knows each heart and understands each story, bless this union forged in the crucible of difficulties and reborn from the ashes of past pain," he solemnly pronounced. "May the love you declare today be like this stream, always in movement, always fresh, able to adapt to each season without losing its essence." Francisco then took from his pocket 2 simple silver bands, similar but not identical like themselves. He placed one on Lola's finger next to the engagement ring. She did the same with the other band, sliding it onto Francisco's finger with hands that trembled slightly from emotion. "By the power vested in me by this community and the love that witnesses this moment," concluded Father Tomas, "I declare you united in marriage of heart and spirit. May what has been joined today only grow stronger with the passing of years." Spontaneous applause erupted from those present when Francisco and Lola sealed their union with a tender but deeply significant kiss. The children joined the embrace, forming a perfect circle that symbolized the family they now officially were. The celebration that followed extended well into the night. There was music and dancing, abundant food, laughter, and some tears of joy. But for Lola, the most memorable moment came when, in a moment of intimacy stolen in the midst of the party, Francisco whispered in her ear, "Welcome home, Lola Sarmiento." And although legally she remained Quintana in her heart, she adopted the new name with the certainty of one who finally finds the place where she belongs. 7 years can seem like a blink in the vast immensity of time, or an eternity when measured in moments of joy, pain, growth, and love. For the Sarmiento family, those 7 years that had passed since the union of Francisco and Lola under the flowering tree had been both things a vertiginous blink and a rich collection of moments that had woven the fabric of their intertwined lives. The cabin by Lake Laca was no longer that austere structure that had received 4 strangers on a stormy night. It had gradually expanded, with rooms added as the family grew and evolved. A wide and welcoming porch now surrounded the main building, partially shaded by a grapevine that Francisco had planted in the 2nd year of their marriage and that now offered sweet grapes in late summer. The garden that Lola had timidly started that first year had become an abundant and organized garden where flowers and vegetables coexisted in harmonious arrangement. A rudimentary but effective greenhouse built by Francisco and Sebastian allowed cultivation even during the coldest months. This spring morning, as the sun rose lazily in a clear sky, Lola was in this garden gathering fresh herbs for lunch. At 38, her beauty had matured like a good wine, acquiring deeper nuances. Some silver strands were beginning to appear among her dark hair, and fine lines were drawn around her eyes, testimony to frequent and genuine smiles. "Mom," called a childish voice from the cabin. "Dad says breakfast is ready." Lola straightened, up contemplating with infinite love the small figure running toward her. Esperanza Sarmiento, who had just turned 6, was the spitting image of her father, the same clear eyes, the same expression of intense concentration when something captured her interest. But she had Lola's easy and melodious laugh, and an energy that illuminated every corner of the house. "I'm coming right away, my darling," she replied, gathering her basket of herbs. "Has Josefina returned?" The child nodded enthusiastically, her chestnut curls bouncing with the movement. "She arrived a while ago with new books for the school," she informed. "And she says she's going to teach me to read in English." Lola smiled, following her youngest daughter toward the house. Josefina, now a young woman of 20, had become the official teacher of San Antonio del Sur. After studying for 3 years in Bariloche, she had returned to the valley determined to improve the education of the region's children. Upon entering the kitchen, the aroma of freshly baked bread and coffee greeted her. Francisco, whose hair now showed abundant gray, but whose strength had not diminished with the years, was serving generous portions of scrambled eggs with herbs. The kitchen, expanded 2 years ago, was now the beating heart of the house, with a large table where the whole family could comfortably gather. Josefina was sitting by the window, absorbed in a book, while absent-mindedly sipping a cup of tea. Seeing her mother enter, she closed the volume and smiled, revealing for an instant the girl she had been beneath the surface of the young woman she had become. "Good morning, Mom," she greeted. The trip was calm. It barely rained on the way back. Lola approached to kiss her forehead, a gesture they maintained despite the passing years. Josefina had traveled to Bariloche the previous week to acquire books and materials for the school, also taking the opportunity to visit a friend from her student days. And Margarita, asked Lola, noticing the absence of her middle daughter. "At the river with Sebastian," replied Francisco, placing the last dish on the table. "They're preparing a surprise for the anniversary. I shouldn't be telling you this." Lola smiled, feeling a warm wave of anticipation. Their wedding anniversary, which they celebrated each year on the day the plum trees bloomed, was fast approaching. 7 years since that day, they had officially united their lives, though in their hearts, the union had begun much earlier. "I'll pretend to be surprised when the time comes," she promised, sitting at the table. Breakfast passed amidst animated conversations. Josefina shared the news from Bariloche, where the population was constantly growing with the arrival of European immigrants. Francisco enthusiastically discussed a new carpentry project furniture for the school that the town had decided to expand the following year. Esperanza, unable to contain herself, frequently interrupted with questions and observations, her curious mind always hungry for information. "I'm going to check the traps," announced Francisco when they finished eating. "Sebastian should be back soon to help with the shed roof." He briefly kissed Lola before leaving a daily gesture that still sent small currents of warmth through her body. 7 years, and she still felt that flutter in her stomach when he looked at her with that intensity that seemed to penetrate all layers to reach her soul. The morning advanced with the quiet efficiency that characterized life in the cabin. Lola and Josefina prepared fruit preserves, taking advantage of the abundant plum harvest. Esperanza played nearby, building complex structures, with pieces of wood that Francisco had carved specifically for her, occasionally asking the meaning of some word she found in the book open at her side. The sound of laughter announced the return of Margarita and Sebastian. At 12, Margarita had become a slender and agile girl with a passion for plants that matched her mother's. Her long black hair, usually gathered in a braid, was now loose and slightly damp, evidence that she had been near the water. Sebastian, now a young man of 17, had inherited Francisco's height and strong build, whom he considered his father. In all senses, that mattered. "The surprise is going to be wonderful, Mom," exclaimed Margarita, unable to contain her enthusiasm despite her brother's warning look. Sebastian sighed, resigned to the effervescent nature of his sister. "It's supposed to be a secret, Marga." He gently reprimanded her, using the diminutive that only he employed. "Don't worry," intervened Lola, winking at her son. "I'm an expert at pretending surprise. I've been practicing for years with the gifts you make me for my birthday." Sebastian smiled, relieved. Of the 3 children Lola had brought to the cabin, that stormy night, he was the one who had established the deepest bond with Francisco. They worked together in the small carpentry they had established, creating furniture and objects they sold not only in San Antonio del Sur, but also in nearby towns. The young man's talent for wood carving had even surpassed his mentors, and some of his creations had caught the attention of merchants from Bariloche, who sold them at considerable prices. The day passed with the rhythmic cadence of a family. That has found its balance, each member with their tasks and passions, but united by bonds as strong as they were invisible. At sunset, when Francisco returned from checking the traps and finishing pending work in town, he found Lola sitting on the porch, contemplating the sunset that tinged the sky with purples and oranges. "What are you thinking about?" he asked, sitting beside her on the bench he had built for her on their 2nd anniversary. Lola rested her head on his shoulder, a natural gesture after so many shared years. "About time," she replied. "About how it passes so quickly and so slowly at once. Josefina is already a woman, Sebastian almost a man. Sometimes I close my eyes and see them as they were that first night, frightened and frozen by the storm." Francisco took her hand, intertwining his fingers with hers. The hands of both showed the marks of hard work, and years lived, but they fit perfectly like complementary pieces of the same whole. "You've done well, Lola," he said with that simplicity that always moved her. "You've raised strong, kind, brave children." "We have raised them," she corrected, gently squeezing his hand. "You have been as much to them as I have, more in some aspects." They remained silent for a moment, contemplating how the first stars began to appear in the evening sky. In the distance they could hear the laughter of Margarita and Esperanza, who were playing near the garden. From the house came the soft melody. that Josefina played on the flute Francisco had carved for her 18th birthday. "Tomorrow I must go to Neuquén," commented Francisco after a while. "Juan Mendez has asked me to accompany him to look for tools he ordered months ago. I'll be away for 3 days." Lola nodded. These occasional trips were part of their life, although each separation, however brief, left a small feeling of emptiness in her. "Sebastian wants to accompany you," she said. "He's been talking about it all week." Francisco smiled, and Lola could see in his eyes the paternal pride he felt for the young man. "He has talent, Lola," he said in a grave voice. "More than I ever had. The new tools we're going to get are mainly for him. I want him to have the best." Lola felt her heart expand with gratitude and love. How much her life had changed since those dark days with Gervasio, when fear was her constant companion. Francisco had never tried to replace the children's biological father in their memory, but he had filled that space with something better, consistent, love, respect, guidance, without authoritarianism. Dinner that night was especially cheerful. Josefina shared stories of her students. Margarita talked enthusiastically about the sunflowers she had planted, whose first leaves were beginning to show. Sebastian and Francisco discussed the details of the next day's trip, while Esperanza tried to convince them to take her with them. "Next time, little one," promised Francisco, caressing her curls. "This trip is for boring men who will talk about wooden tools all the time. You would die of boredom." "I wouldn't be bored," protested the child. "I want to see the big city. Josefina says there are stores with books up to the ceiling." "And there are," confirmed her older sister. "But I propose something better. While Dad and Sebastian are away, we can advance with your English reading, and perhaps if you apply yourself, we can convince Mom to make those cinnamon cookies you like so much." Esperanza's eyes lit up at the prospect, and the topic of the trip was momentarily forgotten. Later, when the children had retired to sleep, and the house was enveloped in night silence, Lola and Francisco remained seated by the fire, sharing the precious moments of intimacy that these years had not eroded, but strengthened. "I'll miss you," she murmured, curled against his chest. Francisco gently kissed her hair, inhaling the aroma of herbs and fertile earth that always accompanied her. "It will be a short time," he replied, "and I'll return with gifts for everyone, especially for you. Our anniversary is approaching." Lola smiled, raising her face to look at him. "I don't need gifts, Francisco," she said sincerely. "You've already given me everything I could wish for: a home, a family, your heart." He caressed her cheek with a tenderness that the years had not diminished. "And yet I want to give you more," he replied. "Each day a little more." Their lips met in a kiss that contained the familiarity of 7 shared years and the spark that had never been extinguished. In that moment, with the fire softly crackling and the wind whispering among the nearby trees, Lola thought that happiness was not a destination, but a path. A path built day by day with moments like this, with difficulties overcome together with. Constant love renewed each dawn. As they headed to their bedroom where intimacy would allow them to express with their bodies what their words sometimes failed to encompass, Lola could not imagine that life still had challenges to face and joys to discover for them. But that night in the cabin that had ceased to be a temporary refuge to become the center of their lives, only the present existed. A present woven with threads of love, respect, and gratitude for all they had built together since that stormy night, when 4 strangers had knocked on the door of a solitary man, forever changing the course of 5 destinies. The morning of departure dawned cool but clear, one of those perfect spring days when the air seems crystalline, and each color intensifies under the clean light of the sun. Lola had risen before dawn to prepare provisions for the journey. The aroma of freshly baked bread and freshly made coffee filled the kitchen, when Francisco and Sebastian appeared dressed for the road, and with expressions that mixed the excitement of the journey with the reluctance to leave home, even if briefly. "You have enough food for a month-long expedition, not 3 days," commented Francisco, observing the carefully wrapped packages Lola had prepared. She smiled, adding a last piece of cheese wrapped in waxed cloth. "You never know what might happen on the road," she replied. "I prefer that you have too much than not enough." Sebastian, who was devouring his breakfast with the appetite typical of his 17 years, nodded emphatically. "Mom is right," he said between mouthfuls. "Besides, it's not just food. We're also taking samples of the work for the merchants in New Ken." The young man had sculpted several small but exquisite pieces, figures of native animals from the region, each with such precise details that they seemed about to come to life. Francisco had suggested that these samples could attract the interest of more important merchants, expanding the reach of their small family business. Josefina entered the kitchen already dressed for the day, although the sun had barely begun to illuminate the sky. As a teacher, she maintained a rigorous schedule, arriving at the school before any student to prepare the day's lessons. "Take care. On the road," she said, embracing first her brother and then Francisco. "And don't forget the books I ordered." "They're on the list," assured Francisco, showing her a paper where several lines of his precise calligraphy detailed the orders they should bring back from the trip. Margarita and Esperanza appeared when the cart was already loaded and ready to depart. The former, sleepy but determined to say goodbye, gave her brother a small package. "They're sunflower seeds," she explained. "So you remember the way home like in that story you used to tell us, Mom?" Lola felt her heart expand at the gesture. Years ago, when Margarita was small and feared Sebastian would abandon them, as Gervasio had done, Lola had told her the story of a young man who always found his way home following the trail of sunflowers his sister planted for him. Esperanza, less sentimental but equally affectionate, demanded promises of specific gifts, a book with illustrations like the one Josefina had described to her, and sweets that could only be found in the big city. Finally, when there were no more excuses to delay the departure, Francisco embraced Lola tightly. They had separated several times during these years, but each farewell retained an echo of that first time when the fear of losing the happiness just found made each goodbye, however, brief, acquire an additional weight. 3 days, he murmured against her hair. "No more, I promise." "We'll be waiting for you," she replied, allowing herself this moment of vulnerability before resuming her usual strength. The cart moved away down the road with Sebastian and Francisco waving, while the women of the family remained standing in front of the cabin. Esperanza, unable to contain her energy, ran after the vehicle for a stretch, waving her hand until Josefina called her to avoid being late for school. Following 3 days passed with the altered but functional routine they had developed for these temporary absences. Lola took care of tasks she normally shared with Francisco. Margarita assumed some additional responsibilities. Esperanza alternated between school and helping at home with intermittent enthusiasm. On the afternoon of the 3rd day, Lola was in the garden instructing Margarita on the particular care required by the new medicinal plants they had incorporated that spring. The sky, which had dawned clear, was beginning to show dark clouds on the horizon, a harbinger of a late storm. "We should collect the hanging clothes," suggested Margarita, observing with concern the changing sky, "and secure the greenhouse windows." Lola nodded, admiring her daughter's foresight. At 12, Margarita showed a maturity and a connection with nature that went beyond what she had taught her. There was something innate in her, an ancient wisdom that sometimes surprised even Doña Carmen, who had taken her as an informal apprentice in the art of medicinal plants. As they hurriedly collected the sheets and garments that fluttered on the clothesline, the sound of hooves and wheels announced the arrival of a vehicle. Lola felt her heart skip a beat of joy, anticipating the return of Francisco and Sebastian. But upon turning toward the road, she saw it was not their familiar cart, but Pedro Mendez's, who was driving with a grave expression. An icy presentiment settled in the pit of her stomach as she approached the newcomer. Pedro dismounted slowly, avoiding her gaze in a way that intensified her unease. "Lola," he finally said, his voice laden with a weight she immediately recognized as the bearer of bad news. "There has been an accident." The world seemed to stop for an instant. Sounds muffled, colors lost intensity. Lola felt her legs threatening to give way, but she remained erect by sheer force of will. "What happened?" she asked, her voice surprisingly firm despite the terror invading her. "Where are they?" "At the Grande River crossing," explained Pedro. Speaking carefully as one who fears each word, might cause irreparable damage. The bridge, with the recent rains, it was weakened. Juan's cart passed without problems, but when Francisco and Sebastian tried to cross a section, gave way. Lola felt Margarita approach her, instinctively seeking her protection while absorbing the terrible news. "Are they?" she began, unable to complete the question. "Alive," Pedro hastened to clarify. "Both. But Sebastian has an injured leg, possibly. Broken. And Francisco—" He stopped, visibly uncomfortable. "Tell me," demanded Lola, her voice acquiring a sharp edge. "He received a strong blow to the head when the cart overturned," continued Pedro. "He's conscious but weak. Juan took them to the doctor's house in San Antonio. He sent me ahead to inform you." Lola was already moving before Pedro finished speaking. With an efficiency born of years facing crises, she began to give precise instructions. "Margarita, prepare clean bandages and the herbs for poultices that Doña Carmen taught you. Put water to boil to sterilize everything. I'll go with Pedro to town." "What's happening?" Esperanza's voice, returning from playing near the stream, interrupted the frantic activity. "Where are you going, Mom?" Lola knelt before her youngest daughter, taking her small hands in hers. How to explain to a 6-year-old child that her world was about to teeter? "Dad and Sebastian have had an accident on the road," she said, with all the calm she could gather. "They're injured but alive. I'm going to look for them to bring them home and take care of them." Esperanza's eyes, so similar to Francisco's, filled with tears. "Are they going to die?" she asked with the heartbreaking frankness of childhood. "No, my darling," replied Lola firmly, though a part of her trembled at the possibility. "They are strong, both of them, but they need our help now." Margarita, who had heard the conversation, intervened. "I'll take care of Esperanza, Mom," she said, her voice trembling slightly but determined. "And I'll prepare everything for when you bring them back. Josefina will return soon from school," added Lola, grateful for her middle daughter's strength. "Explain to her what happened. I'll return as soon as I can." The journey to San Antonio. Del Sur was the longest Lola remembered ever making, despite Pedro driving the cart at a pace that in other circumstances she would have considered reckless. Her mind oscillated between hope and terror, imagining increasingly somber scenarios that she tried to dispel with memories of the strength she had witnessed in Francisco and Sebastian over the years. When they finally arrived at the doctor's house, a modest but clean building at the northern end of town, Lola descended from the cart even before it had completely stopped. She entered like a whirlwind, her heart beating so strongly she feared it might be heard throughout the room. Doctor Morales, a man well along in years but with firm hands and a sharp mind, received her with a grave but reassuring expression. "They are stable, Lola," he informed, anticipating her desperate question. "Sebastian has a fractured leg, but it's a clean fracture. He will heal completely with time and rest. Francisco—" He paused, carefully choosing his words. "The blow to the head was severe. He has lost quite a bit of blood, and although he's conscious, he shows some confusion. We'll have to watch him carefully in the coming days." "I want to see them," said Lola, not as a request but as a statement of immovable intentions. The doctor nodded, guiding her to a room in the back of the house. Upon entering, Lola felt her heart painfully contract. Sebastian lay on a narrow bed, his leg immobilized with splints and bandages. His face, usually tanned, showed an alarming paleness, but his eyes lit up upon seeing her. "Mom," he said, trying to sit up. "I'm fine, really. It's just the leg. But Dad—" His gaze turned toward the other bed where Francisco rested motionless. A white bandage, stained with a crimson circle, covered much of his head. His breathing was regular but shallow, and his eyelids trembled slightly as if he were immersed in a restless dream. Lola approached Sebastian first, kissing his forehead with fierce tenderness. "Don't move," she ordered, her voice mixing love and authority. "Thou need to rest for that leg to heal properly." Then she moved to Francisco's bed. She sat on the edge, taking his hand between hers. It was unusually cold, but it instinctively responded to her contact, his fingers weakly intertwining with hers. "Francisco," she called softly. "I'm here, my love. Lola is here." His eyelids opened with difficulty, revealing those clear eyes she loved so much, though now they seemed clouded by pain and confusion. "Lola," he murmured, his voice barely audible. "Where?" "In San Antonio," she replied gently, caressing his cheek rough with incipient beard. "You had an accident at the bridge, but now you're safe. Soon I'll take you home." A shadow of recognition crossed his face, followed by intense concern. "Sebastian," he said, trying to sit up. "The boy was with me. The bridge collapsed." "I'm here, Dad," replied Sebastian from the other bed. "I'm fine." Francisco seemed to relax slightly upon hearing the voice of his adoptive son, but his gaze remained confused, as if he struggled to assemble scattered fragments of memory. "The cart," he murmured. "The tools. Everything was lost." "None of that matters," said Lola firmly. "You are alive. It's the only thing that matters to me." During the following hours, Lola divided her attention between Francisco and Sebastian. She helped the doctor change the bandages, fed both with nutritious broth, applied cold compresses to Francisco's forehead when fever began to manifest at nightfall. Pedro Mendez returned to the cabin to inform Josefina and the girls, promising to bring them to town the next day, if the condition of the injured allowed. Dr. Morales, impressed by Lola's competence in caring for the sick, finally agreed to her request to transfer them home as soon as Francisco was stable enough for the journey. 3 days minimum, he stipulated. "The head wound is concerning. I need to ensure there's no serious internal damage before allowing him to be moved." Lola nodded, though every fiber of her being yearned to have them all under her roof in the familiar environment that had witnessed so much happiness and that now hoped would be the scene of recovery and healing. The days that followed were a succession of small battles against the fever that came and went against the pain that made Sebastian bite his lip to avoid complaining against the fear that Lola kept at bay by sheer force of will. Josefina arrived, after school bringing Margarita and Esperanza for brief and controlled visits. The complete family had rarely been separated during these years, and the situation was especially difficult for Esperanza, who didn't fully understand why they couldn't simply bring Dad and Sebastian home. On the 5th day, Dr. Morales, finally, gave his approval for the transfer. Francisco's fever had subsided, and although he remained weak, he showed clear signs of improvement. His initial confusion had diminished, though he still had lapses of memory about the events immediately preceding the accident. Sebastian, with youth as his ally, was recovering at a steady pace, though the doctor warned he would need weeks, perhaps months, before being able to put full weight on the injured leg. The return to the cabin was slow and careful. Pedro Mendez had prepared his cart with mattresses and blankets to make the journey as comfortable as possible. Lola traveled alongside her injured ones, attentive to every groan or grimace of pain, ready to order a halt if she deemed it necessary. When the cabin finally appeared before them, bathed in the golden light of sunset, Lola felt a wave of relief so intense she had to hold back tears. Margarita and Esperanza waited for them on the porch, accompanied by Doña Carmen, who had come to assist in the care. "Home," murmured Francisco, his voice stronger than it had been in days. "Finally." With the help of Pedro and Juan Mendez, who had insisted on accompanying them, feeling a certain responsibility for the accident, they moved the injured inside. Francisco was installed in the matrimonial bed, while for Sebastian they prepared a comfortable cot in the living room, where he could be accompanied during the day without needing to go up and down stairs. Doña Carmen, with the authority conferred by her many years as the valley's healer, examined both with a critical eye. "You've done a good job, Lola," she finally declared. "Now it's a matter of time and patience, and my herbs, of course." The old woman had brought an assortment of preparations, infusions, for pain poultices, for inflammation ointments, to prevent infections. Lola, grateful for this knowledge that complemented the doctor's instructions, listened attentively to her directions. Days transformed into weeks, and slowly the family found a new rhythm adapted to the needs of recovery. Sebastian, initially frustrated by his immobility, discovered he could continue carving from his cot, creating smaller, but no less beautiful pieces. Francisco, whose recovery was slower and more arduous, spent hours observing through the window the garden that Lola and Margarita tended with care. One afternoon, when summer was beginning to hint at itself, with longer and warmer days, Lola found Francisco sitting on the porch, He had gotten up by himself, a significant achievement that she celebrated internally, though her expression revealed some concern for the premature effort. "The doctor said you should wait another week before trying to walk alone," she reminded. Him sitting beside him on the bench, Francisco took her hand, a gesture that had become even more frequent since the accident, as if he constantly needed to verify that she was there, real and tangible. "I needed to see the plum trees," he explained. "They're laden with fruit this year." Lola followed his gaze toward the trees they had planted together in the second year of their marriage. Indeed, the branches bent under the weight of small fruits that would soon ripen to acquire a golden tone with reddish spots. "I was afraid of never seeing them again," continued Francisco, his voice laden with an emotion he rarely let show. "When the cart was falling, I thought of you, of the children, of everything I could lose." Lola felt her heart painfully contract. It was the first time he had spoken so openly about the accident. "But you came back," she replied, squeezing his hand. "You came back to us." Francisco nodded slowly, his eyes still fixed on the horizon where the sun began its daily descent. "The circle completes itself," he said after a moment of silence. "We began in winter with a family seeking refuge in the storm. Now we are in summer, and it is I who returns to the refuge we built together." Lola rested her head on his shoulder, allowing the tears she had contained for weeks to finally flow. They were tears of relief, of gratitude, of deep love for this man who had transformed her life. "I love you, Francisco Sarmiento," she murmured, "more than words can express." He gently kissed her hair, inhaling the familiar aroma he would always associate with home. "And I love you, Lola Sarmiento," he replied, "more than life itself." They remained thus together on the porch, as the sun set, painting the sky with the same reddish and golden tones they had contemplated that first night, 7 years and a lifetime ago. From inside the cabin came the mixed voices of their children. Josefina reading a story to Esperanza, Sebastian and Margarita, amicably discussing the design of a carving. The circle had indeed completed itself, not as an end but as constant renewal, like the seasons that succeed each other, each bringing its gifts and challenges, like the fire that had been born that stormy night and that continued to burn, fed by the love of two souls that had found in each other exactly what they needed to heal. As the first stars began to appear in the evening sky, Lola thought of the long road traveled since she was a frightened woman with 3 hungry children desperately knocking on a stranger's door. Now she was Lola Sarmiento, wife, mother, gardener, pillar of her family and community. A woman who had learned that endings can be disguised beginnings, and that even in the darkest night, there always exists the possibility of finding a refuge where the fire burns with sufficient intensity to illuminate the path forward. "Let's go inside," she said softly to Francisco. "The family is waiting for us." And together, supporting each other, as they had done throughout all these years, they returned to the warmth of the home they had built, not with wood and stone, but with love, hope, and the unbreakable determination to create something beautiful from the ashes of the past.